sit better like this.
The committee will come to order. I want to welcome back everyone from our July-August period at home. Everybody looks none the worse for wear on this committee, thank goodness. So we appreciate you joining us this morning. This hearing is entitled Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, Scoring Assumptions and Real-World Implications. One of the core responsibilities of Congress is oversight. It's our job to keep a watchful eye over government departments and agencies to ensure their activities are fairly, efficiently, and effectively executed. In order to competently exercise its oversight authority, Congress has instituted certain instruments and agencies to help in that endeavor, perhaps none as large as the impact that the Congressional Budget Office has. CBO is critical to Congress's oversight and legislative activities. Members rely on the experts at CBO to provide well-reasoned, nonpartisan analysis that informs and helps shape congressional decision-making. So we appreciate and value the professional work done by CBO and that they perform day in and day out. In fact, it's because of the critical role CBO plays in oversight and legislative processes that we're here today to specifically examine how CBO's analysis of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation and the assumptions within that analysis is impacting the ability of Congress to perform our legislative and oversight duties. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation is a group within CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, tasked with developing and testing new delivery and payment models for healthcare providers under Medicare and Medicaid. There have been legitimate questions and concerns raised about CMMI's new Medicare payment models, concerns with the adverse impact these experiments might have on the practice of medicine and patient access to critical healthcare treatments, questions about the agency's decision to require mandatory rather than the usual voluntary participation of healthcare providers in models and demonstrations, and generally whether the new models exceed CMMI's legal authority and how CBO assessment may adversely affect our fiscal situation. It's important to remember when we talk about new payment models that we're not just talking about a computer simulation or a science project somewhere in the lab. We're talking about real people and their access to care. We're talking about whether or not seniors on Medicare will be able to receive the medications or treatment options that their physicians believe are in the best interest of their patients. There are real lives that could be impacted, potentially harmed by these suggested changes, even by the models themselves, because CMMI is making participation in the demonstrations mandatory rather than voluntary before the effects of such changes to care, quality, cost, and outcomes are known. This is why oversight of CMMI's activities are so incredibly important. The broad powers vested in CMMI and the agency's interpretation of that authority have the potential to further degrade Congress's lawmaking authority by shifting decision-making away from elected officials and into the hands of unelected folks. CMMI has the authority to design and implement different models and test those models on segments of the population for an unspecified and limitless period of time. When you add in the fact that CMMI has determined it can mandate participation in these experiments and run them indefinitely, you have a scenario where the agency has, in effect, enacted changes to the Medicare and Medicaid programs and circumventing Congress itself. This assumption of lawmaking authority by the executive branch takes power out of the hands of the legislature, no matter which political party controls which branch of government at any given time. Such a precedent, we believe, is unhealthy for our democracy. Unfortunately, under its current analysis, the Congressional Budget Office tells us that altering CMMI's demonstration activities would result in a substantial loss of savings. CBO appears to come to this conclusion by assuming that CMMI's abilities to produce savings supersedes those of Congress. If there's an overlap between legislative initiatives and CMMI's authority, legislative proposals are secondary and saving assumptions favor CMMI. It is this reasoning that the executive is more effective at legislating than the Congress that is so concerning. In its first 5 years of operation, CMMI has spent nearly $6.1 billion with no tangible savings yet to show for it. And yet CBO tells us that they expect the program to cover those expenses with savings by 2017. While at the same time, in its own long-term budget outlook, CBO has admitted that it doesn't know which, if any, of the current demonstration projects CMMI has embarked upon will result in savings. Admittedly, there will always be a certain level of uncertainty in any estimate or projection. What concerns this committee and others is the certainty with which CBO analysis seems to project substantial savings by CMMI in the future. Those yet unrealized supposed savings make it a challenge for policymakers on either side of the aisle to propose changes to the program, which in turn makes it challenging, if not impossible, for policymakers to exercise our oversight and legislative authority. At the end of the day, our goal is to ensure the integrity of Congress's oversight authority. And because we value the input of CBO in the legislative process, it's important that we have the opportunity to question and understand the underlying assumptions and methodology that inform the basis of that analysis. And because we believe seniors on Medicare ought to have access to life-improving and life-saving treatments that their doctors recommend, it's important that we ensure that Congress is able to exercise that oversight authority. And to discuss these issues, we're joined today by Mark Hadley, who's the Deputy Director of the Congressional Budget Office, and we welcome you, Mr. Hadley. The second panel will be comprised of Dr. Joe Antos, the Wilson H. Taylor Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, Ted Okon, the Executive Director of the Community Oncology Alliance, Dr. Mark Madden, an orthopedic surgeon at Ortho Virginia, and Topher Spiro, Vice President for Health Policy at the Center for American Progress. And we welcome all of you. And I'm pleased to yield to our standing-in ranking member, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also would like to welcome all of the witnesses testifying today. I appreciate you sharing your expertise and experiences with us. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation is a vital tool for improving quality and containing costs in healthcare. Its research is showing us that reducing costs and improving healthcare quality can and should go hand in hand. The Innovation Center is essentially the R&D shop for Medicare and Medicaid and is crucial in finding solutions to one of the biggest challenges we face as a nation. Healthcare is an evolving, dynamic, and highly technical arena. There's long been widespread agreement on the broad goal of providing higher quality care and reducing unnecessary spending. But transforming that ambitious vision into a concrete, detailed reality takes time and expertise. It requires giving real flexibility to Medicare and Medicaid so we can inject innovation into these programs. That is why Congress created the Innovation Center, to give the HHS Secretary the authority needed to develop and test new models of payment and care, and to expand demonstrations nationwide to get the most effective results. But in these demos, the administration must show evidence of improving quality without increasing costs, or, on the flip side, reducing costs without harming quality or limiting benefits. This is an incredibly important tool, and like all executive branch activities, it merits congressional oversight. From my understanding, the majority is concerned that vigorous oversight of the Innovation Center is lacking, and that the agency is overstepping its authority. If that is what they are contending, I would suggest that we have a hearing with witnesses from HHS, from CMS, and from the Innovation Center itself, and our members can ask them all the tough questions they can come up with. But this is a separate issue from the other stated topic for today, scoring. Director Hadley, I am glad CBO would at least have an opportunity to present its view. You are here today because the CBO estimates that legislation repealing the Innovation Center or delaying certain demonstrations would increase the deficit. And in the mind of the majority, as the chairman said, that means you have somehow undermined Congress's authority. Under this logic, CBO undermines congressional authority anytime it estimates that something Congress wants to do would cost money. CBO's estimates are certainly inconvenient for members who want to repeal the Innovation Center or block certain activities. But it is CBO's job to give us their best estimate of legislation. It is Congress's job to decide what to do with that information. And let's be honest, the Republican leadership ignores CBO scoring when it suits their purposes, as they did with all of the permanent tax cuts approved in the House this Congress. If Republican leadership doesn't like a CBO score, it can waive its own cut-as-you-go rule or redefine the baseline and pass the bill regardless of the cost. I'm guessing the majority will ultimately end up doing that here. And that's too bad, because these demonstration projects being pursued by the Innovation Center are incredibly important. A proposed demonstration modifying payment for Part D drugs has attracted a lot of attention, and the American people are increasingly concerned about the ongoing spikes in prescription drug prices that do not appear to bear any relation to R&D costs, quality, or any other reasonable metric. Some members of this committee have recommended modifications to this particular demonstration and have communicated their concerns to the administration during the public comment period on the proposal. Constructive congressional engagement with the Innovation Center is much more likely to guarantee positive results for the American people and for the budget. That type of input and oversight can move us toward achieving the broader goal of controlling Medicare costs and protecting beneficiaries' coverage and access to quality care. However, as with most matters related to the Affordable Care Act, House Republicans have simply called for the Innovation Center to be repealed. House Speaker Ryan in June released the GOP's so-called A Better Way on health care, which would repeal it. In June, the Appropriations Committee approved a 2017 Department of Health and Human Services funding bill that would defund the Innovation Center starting next year. They have no alternative for improving care and containing costs. They have one idea, and that is privatizing Medicare. They want to convert Medicare's guarantee into a voucher for future enrollees that may or may not cover premium costs. Republicans have never provided evidence of how their plan will magically make health care significantly cheaper over the long term. It is sure to shift substantial costs and risk to seniors while undermining traditional Medicare by attracting the healthiest enrollees to private plans. Once again, Republicans and Democrats share a stated goal of providing quality care and reducing Medicare costs, but vastly different approaches on how we can get there. As always, I'm hopeful that with more debate and discussion, we can bridge that divide. I look forward to the testimony today, and again, thank the witnesses for their time and input. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'd now like to welcome our first witness, and on the first panel, Mr. Hadley, I want to thank you for your time today. The committee has received your written statements, and without objection, they'll be made part of the formal record. You have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and you may begin when ready.
Chairman Price, Congressman Yarmouth, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me today to testify about CBO's estimates of the budgetary effects of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. The center was established in 2010 to conduct demonstration projects that test new ways to deliver and pay for health care, especially in Medicare, trying to identify approaches that reduce spending and improve quality. The center's process for conducting those demonstrations mark a shift from how demonstrations were conducted in the past. Before the center was created, the Department of Health and Human Services conducted demonstration projects, either initiated by HHS or mandated by legislation. Most projects did not reduce federal spending, though a few did. CBO judged that most proposals to establish new demonstration projects during that period would, like the average project, be unlikely to reduce federal spending. In contrast, several aspects of the center's process for conducting demonstrations increase the likelihood of finding successful approaches that achieve federal savings. The center has a robust method to select new ideas to be tested. The center prioritizes demonstrations that can be empirically evaluated. The center may modify demonstrations based on early experience. The financial resources available to the center are large enough to test a variety of demonstrations, but small enough to create an incentive to end unsuccessful demonstrations and conserve resources for other projects. Finally, HHS can expand successful demonstrations. In this context, a demonstration is successful if it is expected to decrease spending without harming quality, or to improve quality without increasing spending. So far, the center has pursued a range of demonstrations in different parts of the Medicare program. 2 demonstrations have met the requirement that expansion would not increase Medicare spending. The Secretary of Health and Human Services has announced plans to expand one of them. CBO estimates that the center's activities will reduce federal spending by about $34 billion over the next decade. We project that amount the center will spend to conduct demonstrations will be more than offset by the resulting reductions in Medicare spending benefits. The effect on federal spending are larger in the later years of CBO's baseline, but we project the effects will remain relatively small compared to the size of the overall Medicare program, about 0.75% in 2026. Such estimates are subject to considerable uncertainty, however. Projecting what the center will spend to conduct demonstrations is relatively straightforward. The center receives $10 billion every 10 years, but for its first few years, as it ramped up its operations, it did not spend the full $1 billion per year. It therefore has resources to spend slightly more than that over the next decade. How the demonstrations will affect spending on Medicare benefits, and thus federal costs or savings resulting from the center's activities, is more uncertain. CBO's 10-year projection does not reflect any assessment of a particular demonstration. Instead, CBO's projection is based on judgments about how effectively the center will identify, refine, and expand approaches that reduce spending. A given set of demonstrations started in a particular year will increase federal costs at first, but over time, as HHS continues and then expands the successful demonstrations in that set and cancels the unsuccessful ones, we expect that the net result will be savings. CBO has been asked to estimate the budgetary effects of legislative proposals that interact with the center's activities. We apply some general principles when doing so and consider the specific circumstances of each case. Most demonstrations have not yet been tested, but we expect the center's overall process of testing, evaluating, and expanding demonstrations will produce savings. Some proposals that would tend to reduce those savings and thus increase spending are proposals that prevent demonstrations from occurring, limit HHS's ability to modify a demonstration based on early experience, or permit or require a demonstration to be expanded even if it increased spending. Other proposals that interact with the center's efforts would probably reduce the federal spending. Those that expand a demonstration that HHS has decided not to expand, even though an evaluation conclusively showed that it reduced federal spending, or expand such a project, faster or more intensively than the center had planned. CBO's estimate of the budgetary effects of the center's activities involves judgments that are inherently uncertain. Over time, however, we expect to learn more about the center's operations and the extent to which they can be expected to lead federal savings. We will update our estimates based on that new evidence. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hadley, and I want to thank you again for the work at CBO. One of the main concerns that we have, however, is the ability for legislators to know what the rules of the game are so that they can actually help to work together to solve problems that we in the legislative branch perceive are out there. So to arrive at all these answers, you have a model. CBO has a model. I'm reminded of the SGR model that was indecipherable for many of us, but there was a model, and it was printed. It was out on paper, and you could see it, and people could look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense. No, that doesn't make sense. Do you have a model that you're able to share for how CBO arrives at their scoring conclusions as it relates to CMMI?
Yes, I'd be happy to describe how we estimate those effects.
You have an equation? You have what goes into it and what comes out?
So the considerations that go into it are what the overall savings or expenses that we'd expect to occur.
Well, I understand that, but is there any way for a member of this committee or a member of Congress to know exactly what's included? What are the parameters in that model? Specific parameters.
The specific parameters we describe in the testimony. We expect that for any given set of projects, any cohort of projects that begin in 1 year.
Let me suggest that members don't know what's in it and that we haven't been able to get information from you. Let me ask you a specific question. You mentioned in your written testimony that the competitive bidding program for DME, durable medical equipment, is a notable success. Quote, CBO's words, notable success. This is a demonstration that results in your perspective, significantly less Medicare spending. It's also led to disruptions in care for seniors and is associated with an increase in mortality, can increase the inpatient admissions and higher inpatient costs. I'd like to submit for the record a report from the Minority Quality Forum that highlights this. My question isn't to talk about the specific clinical aspect of it. My question is, does your model include those parameters, the costs of increasing hospitalization, the costs of increasing treatment for challenged diseases that aren't treated because of the competitive bidding model?
Yes, the overall model looks at the framework, the overall framework that's provided in the statute. That the requirement is that the center can only expand projects that would improve quality without increasing spending, or would decrease spending without harming quality.
No, I understand that, but what we're unable to get the answer, do you look at, is there a metric in the model that says increased hospitalization?
Yes, we look at the overall savings that resulted from the previous demonstrations.
You look specifically at increased hospitalizations, readmissions.
We would consider that when we looked at a specific demonstration. The model that we used is based on the whole history of demonstrations prior to the creation of the center. And so that's a level of granularity that we don't necessarily have in a specific model. But when we would look at a specific case for an individual demonstration, we would take that into account.
This gets to the point, though. As you said, it's a level of granularity that you don't necessarily include, and that's the problem, is that for those of us who are trying to help solve these problems here, there isn't any way for us to know what CBO is going to cite in its model, because we don't know what the model is. You all don't share with us the model. And there are a couple examples that I would point out to you. The bundled payment arrangements, which come from the ACO investments in improving care transition, managing post-acute care, effectively getting a credit for ACO-generated savings. There's no way for us to know whether that's included in the model, because you don't publish the model. You don't publish the equation for how you get to the score. Let me get to the specific amount that CBO says the CMMI will save. In your 2010 estimate of the Affordable Care Act, the CMMI projected savings for 2010 to 2019 budget window was $1.3 billion. In order to achieve those net savings of $1.3 billion, it appears to me, help me with my math if I'm not correct, but the CMMI has been estimated to save somewhere around $400 to $500 million at this point. That's from...
Yes, it's less than, for 2017, we expect that CMMI will have savings of less than $1 billion, but.
So we'll get to it, if it's $400 to $500 million to this point in the first 6 years, 2017 is $500 million, we'll get to $1 billion over 7 years, which leaves 3 years, I guess, to get a net savings of $1.3 billion when they will have spent $10 billion. They've already spent over $6 billion. And yet your current your current model for what they'll save over the next 3 years is $500 million in 17, $1 billion in 18, and $1 billion in 19, which means they will have lost $6.5 billion, $6 billion over the 10-year window that you projected in 2010.
So our estimates from 2010 to today have not substantially changed. That is, we're looking at different windows of the same phenomenon.
No, I understand.
So,
but my point is that your estimate in 2010 is off. You said they'd save about $1.3 billion. In fact, they're going to lose over 2010 to 2019. They're going to lose about $6 billion because they net.
The savings from CMMI projects we expect to be large enough to produce savings around $1.3 billion. That was our estimate in 2010.
Correct.
The savings have not substantially been altered. We expect that that would still occur over that same pattern. It's just that there is a significant amount of savings that is required to offset the spending, as you note, that CMMI spends to conduct the demonstrations.
And they're not going to get to that point. My point is that CBO's estimate, and in good faith in 2010, was not accurate based upon where we find ourselves today. That is, we're not going to have a net $1.3 billion in savings in 2019 in the program because they're going to spend over $10 billion and save about $3 billion by your own estimate today in your testimony. That's That's my point, and that's the concern. I've got just a few minutes left, and I want to touch on a major issue, again, that results in our inability as legislators to get to the right answer. When many of us on either side of the aisle have come to CBO and have said, we've got a brilliant idea for how to accomplish some significant savings or higher quality in Medicare. And time after time after time, CBO tells, and we want to know how much that's going to cost. What's the score going to be? Because we rely on that so much here in Congress because of the fiscal situation that we find ourselves in. And the response that we get from CBO is virtually, whatever it is that you've come up with, CMMI has the authority to do that, would have done that, could have done that, will do that, and therefore whatever change you make, you suggest making from a policy standpoint to CMMI results in a cost, not a savings, a cost, even if the savings would have been realized if that were looked at de novo. So you see the challenge that we have as legislators, that is that our own Congressional Budget Office seems to have a default that endorses or supports an executive branch program without the ability for the legislative branch to modify that program without having a significant cost. Does that ring true to you at all?
No, Mr. Chairman. CBO does not.
Tell me why I'm wrong.
CBO does not make policy recommendations. Our role is to provide objective information for the Congress.
So if a member believes that a program that CMMI is putting out there, for example, durable medical equipment, that a program that they're putting out with is harming individuals, is costing the country more, we propose to either delay that or end that or modify that in a way that we believe would not only improve quality care but save money. CBO tells us, oh no, because if it would have saved money, CMMI would have already come up with it or will come up with it. That's in your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, when we think about the cost of any specific demonstration or to proposals that would modify that proposal or that demonstration or that would delay it or prevent it from occurring, we think about what we know about that individual case. So each time we are going to look at what is known about that specific one. If it turned out that we knew enough about that demonstration to know that it actually was increasing costs, then stopping...
Based upon what CMMI tells you?
Based on all of the evidence that we're able to gather about that demonstration, from talking with stakeholders, from talking with CMMI, from looking at evaluations, and other scientific research about that particular approach. If we had information that was sufficient for us to know the aspects of a particular demonstration, then we would use that. Our current estimates are instead based on what we think the overall process is. And the reason we have to use that is we don't have enough information to know anything about particular demonstrations.
My time's run out, and I appreciate that. But I just want to underscore the fact that members on both sides of the aisle are having challenges getting CBO to recognize that the legislative branch is the policymaking branch, and the default ought not be to the executive branch. And there many of us believe that, in fact, that's the case in this specific instance. I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hadley, I want to let you go back through the original 2010 estimate and talk about the progress so far year to year and why you think that Chairman's assessment of where we are vis-a-vis the original estimates and your scoring are accurate. I'll let you defend the score there and walk us through the experience so far and what you've observed during the 5 years or so that the plan has been in effect.
I'd be happy to. The estimate of spending is relatively straightforward. We expected the center to spend about $1 billion a year after it got ramped up. But in the first few years, spending was substantially lower, and that was because they needed to establish their procedures and select projects to test. Our estimates of the spending over the 5-year period from 2011 through 2015 are very close to what actually occurred. We were a little bit slower than was expected. We expected a ramp of spending, that is, it would be a progression upward. The ramp ended up looking a little bit more like an S-curve, where spending was lower in the first few years and then higher in the later years, but the overall pattern was about what we expected. We know much less about what happened with this savings. Now, we expected there to be savings in each year from the projects that were successful, even before they were evaluated. And we are only now at the point where projects are being evaluated. What we do know is that projects that the center has decided to test represent a wide range of approaches, and many of them have been designed in a way that allows for rigorous scientific assessment. So to that extent, the center's activities are in line with what we expected originally. And so some of the savings that generate the $1.3 billion over the first 10-year period were the net number of, when you compare the spending with the savings from the center, there were some savings that we anticipated in those first few years, which is different than just the spending line, which represents the first $10 billion that the center had to spend.
Now, I infer from what the chairman said that since the savings on a current basis are running somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 million a year, that they will continue to be at the same rate, and therefore you couldn't get to your overall savings in the 10-year budget window. But I assume different things will happen over that latter 5 years, so that demonstration projects that have shown promise will be expanded, so therefore the savings increase, and those that are holding the overall savings down or not being successful would be discontinued, so that you can't make an assumption that just because we're only saving $500 million in 2016, that we won't save $2 billion in 2020. So is that assumption correct?
Yes, Congressman. For each of the sets of projects begun in particular years, we expect them to follow a pattern where during the first many years, the projects will not generate savings that are sufficient enough to offset the total amount of spending for that group of demonstrations. But then as the center discontinues the many projects that we expect will not succeed in demonstrating savings or improving quality, that in those later years there will be savings. And then in the kind of even later years of that cohort, there will be more savings as the successful ones are expanded. That pattern we expect to occur for each of the cohorts that are begun, and what we're seeing over the current 10-year period are more sets of mature cohorts, and we'll expect that to continue for a few more years until we hit a steady state of mature cohorts.
And so your original budget window went through 2020. So have you projected beyond the 2020 end of that window?
We've projected to 2026. And that is the largest year of savings you'll see in Table 2 of our testimony.
And have you, in analyzing this and kind of the way CMMI works and the projects that you've been able to observe over these last few years, have you seen any potential alternatives to finding approaches to achieving savings in these areas? Have you seen any options to the kind of innovative demonstration projects that this agency is implementing?
Let me have you hold that question, if I may, and stop the clock, if you will. I've just been informed that the cameras have gone down, and I want the public to hear your scintillating question and the scintillating answers. This will take about 3 minutes. We're going to bring the system down and bring it back up, and I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Great, we're going to start back up here, and I apologize for interrupting. I would remind folks that we'll be in a different hearing room next Congress, so hopefully the mics and system will work better.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I don't feel personally attacked by this, but I guess it takes a while to get back on our game after 7 weeks. Mr. Hadley, you want to continue with your answer? It was basically, the question was, in your observation over the last 5 years and analyzing what these demonstration projects have been able to do, whether in the course of that you've seen any alternatives to the kind of demonstration projects that CMMI is conducting, any alternatives as to how we might accomplish some of the same goals that we all share of providing quality care at less cost?
Well, there's certainly a range of ideas that the center could choose to consider that would have the potential for producing savings. And although I don't have any specific ones I can point to as new ideas that they're not considering that they could be considering, we do expect that there are a full range of ideas that they're not considering at this point that could be considered and be expected to produce similar savings.
So, for instance, if actually some of the demonstration projects, whether it's the Part B demonstration project or the bundled payment project or the DME competitive bidding one, if Congress had actually introduced those, we actually could have achieved savings that we could have used in our own pay goal to save money. And we could continue to do that. We can look for ways legislatively to create demonstration projects that might, if we're smart enough to do that, I haven't seen much evidence of that, but that the potential exists, that you would then score as savings through the legislative process.
Our estimate of the savings you could receive from any given demonstration depends on really the history of demonstrations before the center was established. And that history shows that the vast majority of demonstrations did not produce savings. A few actually increased costs, but there were a few that resulted in substantial savings. We think that the features of the center that allow it to create the expectation of savings are the ability to pivot, that is to make adjustments based on early information to adjust the demonstration if they find a more effective way to pursue it. The testing and evaluation of the center, and then that it uses to empirically evaluate whether a demonstration is effective, and the ability to expand. I can't speculate about the savings that one piece of legislation might have generated, but I can say that that providing the ability to have those same features, that is to make some early adjustments, to provide for testing, and then to cancel projects that don't achieve savings and to expand projects that do, those are the features that, if included in a similar piece of legislation, would be expected to produce similar results.
I guess maybe I can ask it in a better way, and that is, has there been any evidence that Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has been able to come up with the types of demonstration projects that have demonstrated savings in the system?
Most of the demonstrations that were tested before the center was established did not produce savings, and in some cases, they were designed in a way that the evaluation did not allow for a rigorous scientific result, so you can't be sure whether they produce savings or not.
Right. My point being that there are options available to us as a legislative body to try and find opportunities to save money and deliver quality care within Medicare, and we can either try to come up with them ourselves, which we have not been particularly effective at doing, or we can create something like CMMI that is tasked with analyzing the potential for savings and has the expertise to implement plans that, in your estimation anyway, and I guess there's certainly enough evidence over 5 years to indicate do produce savings in certain areas if done effectively. So that's why I think efforts to repeal this initiative are misguided, and I think the fact that you've scored the fact that this would result in a loss of savings if we repealed CMMI would not be at least fiscally advisable. So I thank you for your testimony and responses, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Vice Chairman, Mr. Rokita is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I want to pick up on that very point, which I completely disagree with the substitute ranking member's proposition here. Let me give you an example. If I filed a bill that came up with a better idea for Medicare Part B and reforming it, under your latest report, you would come back and tell me in my office, privately at least, that, oh, no need to do that, we don't worry about that, CMMI does it, and because they're the good bureaucrats they are, they're going to come up with everything in their jurisdiction to solve the problem, and they're going to get the savings. And that's the core of the problem here, Mr. Substitute Ranking Member. I'm sorry. Hey, I'm in a good mood. That's better what I usually call you, right? So while the chief example here is CMMI, this is not, Mr. Ranking Member, CMMI hearing, as you said in your opening statement. This is about you. This is about your office. This is about Mr. Hall and how he's running his office, in my opinion. You are supposed to be the umpire, the referee. You are supposed to use the same methodology no matter who's asking you. And what I'm hearing from you and your answers to the chairman is that you're using your judgment, but as far as I'm concerned, that judgment is sticking your finger in the air and seeing which way the political wind's going, including what your political bias is. Because you cannot demonstrate the methodology or the formula or the equation that you're using to say CMI is doing the great job that you claim it is. I have your testimony in front of me. Give me the page number and the lines where this equation methodology is that you use to judge CMMI.
It's not in there, Senator.
Why not?
Well, it's not laid out in that level of detail in the
Why not?
testimony.
Isn't this the most important hearing you've ever attended and been a subject of?
Yes, it is.
And you were briefed on what this is about. Why isn't it in here? Does it exist anywhere?
Yes, as I've explained, what we look at is on a cohort by cohort basis, the expectation that there will be
Yes, but
savings.
no. The equation, the model, is it written down anywhere?
Yes, Congressman,
Where?
in our offices.
Internal policy document, or what do you use when you have your staff work on this?
So we look at a variety of resources, we talk to a variety of stakeholders, and then for the individual efforts at modeling, we will take any available evidence and use the best
So
information
whatever the
we have.
bureaucrats at CMMI say are the result of the demonstration project is what you'll use in making your judgment.
No, that's not correct.
Okay, what is correct then? Where did I miss?
So we would look critically at the evaluations that they have put forward, and in some cases, we will disagree with them. In some cases, we will take a different lens than they do.
So when you look critically at the demonstration projects, what criteria do you use and where is that written down?
The
That would be
criteria.
part of a model or formula, an equation.
So those are slightly different ideas, and let me address each one of them. So in terms of evaluating the research that other people have done, because we are enormous consumers of scientific information, we would look at the things like the study design. Was it a rigorous study? Did they have a proper control group? Did they consider ancillary effects? And one of the differences between us and CMMI is where they are tasked with thinking about the effects just within the health programs, we take a broader lens. We look both over a longer period and we look at the effect on the budget as a whole.
So why don't you use those lenses on congressional ideas?
We use the same lenses on both sets of ideas.
You do. Can you give me an example? Any recent bill, anything in your testimony, anything you can provide me within 2 weeks?
We'd be happy to give that to you.
Within 2 weeks?
Yes.
Okay. Conversations with Mr. Hall on this subject matter that I'm bringing up, have you had any?
Yes.
And how many? Is there a
At
concern?
least, so as we've been scoring individual pieces of legislation, at least a few, and then probably more than a dozen as I've prepared for this testimony.
Right. Any indication that you're going to adjust your sales at all?
Excuse me?
Adjust your procedures?
So our procedures are the same, but our results may differ as we gain new evidence. Remember, We follow the evidence that's available. And there are many questions we have about CMMI, which could change the scoring of future CMMI projects dramatically. We lay out some of those near the end of the testimony. But some of the most important ones are, to what extent does the center actually adapt based on early information? Does it actually change the demonstrations, or is that really an irrelevant factor? Some of the questions, but the most important question is really, to what extent does it identify projects that achieve savings and expand those projects?
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquale is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you back. You know, my friend from Indiana, Mr. Chairman, through you, you question the umpire, to use your terms, judgment. In fact, you're impugning Mr. Hadley in terms of the processes being, you have every right to know what, and I have every right to know what the process is that they arrive at the conclusion. When you know what motivates the work that they're doing, at the very heart of the system, we're moving from a system that pays for quantity to a system that pays for quality. It was a centerpiece of the ACA. And from what I've heard this morning and what I've read in the past, it would seem to me, with all objectivity I'm trying to have on this issue, is that the predictions that were made about Medicare, which came from the ACA, this is what money is going to be saved or is not going to be saved, they're pretty much on target, pretty much on target. And you have every right to know what the methodology is. That's not what I'm questioning here at all. But we haven't even passed a budget. We haven't even passed a budget, and for us, in the Budget Committee, not the Ways and Means Committee, the Chairman and I are on the Ways and Means Committee, and we've gone over these 62 times. But we're not affecting what these savings are going to be or not going to be. And you mean to tell me, and you mean to tell the audience, that if you could be assured that the methodology was something that you could approve of, and you saw the particular savings that were predicted and are coming true over the 7 years, the 10 years where the estimates were made, that you would change your mind about the ACA? You're not going to change your mind about the ACA. And you have every right to your opinion. I want to change the ACA in many ways, but I will in a second. But I want to continue to get as much good out of it as we can and change, like we've done Social Security, Medicare, and like we did Medicaid, when both sides got together. There was no hope of that happening with this group. And you know it, as well as I, as well as myself. My friends on the other side have been critical of the fact that the CBO I'll get back there, I'm not going to forget you, changes its, the repeal of the Innovation Center and changes to its demonstrations in a way that adds to the deficit. You don't want to hear that. You're saying, from what they're concluding, I don't know whether you're agreeing with it, that what we'll do is add to the deficit if we make the changes that you guys and gals are considering. Mr. Hadley, let me ask you a quick question. When the CBO determines that a bill will add to the deficit, does the CBO also require the Congress to provide an offset for the amount?
Congressman, when CBO produces an estimate, we deliver it to the Congress, and it's up to the Budget Committee and the
Yeah, you
Congress
don't
to
require
enforce
the
the rules.
Congress. You don't require the Congress to come up with an offset for that particular amount. Am I right or wrong? Now I'll yield to the gentleman.
And I agree with the gentleman. This is not about.
Good, we have an agreement.
This is not
That's
about
very good.
ACA. This is, as I said originally, this is about the structural issue that we're seeing crop up here in the
But my
congressional,
friend,
in the congressional budget
We
office.
can have a dialogue?
So, and what we're seeing
That's
here
my time.
is an umpire where things are judged by one way, and then when we file bills, they apparently aren't judged at all, or judge a different way.
I'm not defending
That is the
that.
problem.
Don't put me in a position of
And-
defending that.
And finally, I say this committee did pass a budget. I mean, no help from the gentleman, but
No,
we did pass a budget.
Excuse me, the Congress did not pass, the House of Representatives.
The committee
did
did.
not pass the budget, come on. We don't have a budget. The heck are we talking about, Mr. Chairman? If we had a budget, then we could say, well, this would be, we're interested in the formula, we're interested how this work and that. We're not gonna change your mind. Let me ask you one more question in the 15 seconds. Did the CBO determine that the Congress did not need to pay for the tax cuts that were supposed to be made for unpaid, the unpaid part of this? Did the CBO say that the Congress need not pay for those tax cuts, the credits, make up for it?
Gentleman's
Did you
time
tell
has
the
expired.
Congress that?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Can I get his
You may answer
answer,
briefly.
Mr. Chairman?
Answer briefly.
Thank you. We delivered estimates. We do not enforce the.
Thank you,
congressional
Mr. Hadley, you've done a great job today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, you've done a great job also.
Thank you. Mr. McClintock's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As to the assurances that the ACA is saving us money, I understand premiums will be announced next month for the coming year, and the estimates that I have seen is that they'll be jumping between 10 and 20%. Kaiser Foundation estimates that in nearly a third of the counties in this country, people will be able to choose among exactly one health plan under the ACA. So we'll see soon enough the truth of those estimates. Mr. Chairman, first of all, Citizens Against Government Waste has submitted a letter in which they praise the committee for holding this hearing, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent that be included in the record,
Without objection.
and also to share with the members one paragraph that leads me to my first question. The President of Citizens Against Government Waste says, "We urge you and your colleagues to ask the witnesses at the hearing, particularly CBO Deputy Director Mark Hadley, for a detailed explanation and analysis of the underlying rationale for the scoring model, as well as its impact on Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries, healthcare providers, and taxpayers." I think we've had the answer to that question. It sounds to me like you're not doing analysis anymore, you're just guessing. I mean, you speak in theoretical terms of the work of the CMMI, but the fact of the matter is we're now 6 years into its work. We appropriated $10 billion for that work. It's already expended half of that amount of money, and we've not seen any savings. So this is no longer a theoretical discussion. We're looking at an actual record here.
Congressman, at this point, we have limited information about the success or lack of success of individual demonstrations. So we are only now starting to see kind of two of the critical elements. One is the extent to which projects succeed, and then the responses that the Center
at the
has
same
to
time,
them.
you're telling us that we can expect major savings. A 2015 CBO blog says, because CBO expects that some projects will prove successful and will expand, the agency estimates that CMMI will generate savings that exceed the cost of conducting the tests and trials. However, CBO cannot predict which projects will work. Over the 2016 to 25 period, those net savings will total $27 billion, CBO estimates. So on the one hand, you're saying we don't know what's going to work or what's not, but it's going to save us $27 billion. Do you understand the credibility problem you have with this committee?
I understand that it's a difficult issue on many different levels. One of them is that the success of any demonstration is difficult to observe.
Well, precisely right. So why don't we get at least an honest accounting? It could, best case scenario, it could save this amount. Worst case scenario, it could cost us this amount. We won't know until we know A, what the program is, and B, whether it's working or not. I mean, basically, the CMMI is there to make proposals for costs, healthcare cost savings, correct? We give them $10 billion to come up with those proposals. You have scored that as a $27 billion cost savings before you even know what the proposals are. And your basis for doing so is to say, oh, well, you know, other studies have saved that amount, so we expect this one will. I just wonder how far you'd get with a venture capitalist if you went to them and said, well, we'd like a $10 billion investment for our new research project. Well, the first thing a venture capitalist is going to say is, well, what's your research project? Well, we don't know yet, but, you know, other research is generated X amount, so we're predicting we will too. That's not going to get very far with anybody that's using their own money.
When I was first learning this subject, I also made the analogy to venture capital, and I think it's a good one, that one of the difficulties when you're thinking about innovation is most of the attempts are going to fail.
Yeah, but
it's only the ones
you don't
that-
even know what the projects are before you're giving us savings estimates on them. This is the problem. The CBO used to be the absolute gold standard for fiscal projections, fiscal analysis of, I'm reminded of the old Dragnet series that featured old by-the-book detective, and whenever a witness would stray off and start offering speculation or opinions, his signature line was, "The facts, please, just the facts." And that's what the CBO used to do. And we, as Congress, rely on your work, its reliability, its accuracy, its objectivity, and what you are hearing is a lack of faith in that work today. And if you're the Congressional Budget Office and the Congress here is telling you we are losing faith in your work product, that's a big problem for you, it's a big problem for us, and it's a big problem for the country.
Has expired. Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castro, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing on the importance of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation and how it's helping reduce spending in Medicare while at the same time bringing needed reforms and improving health outcomes. And I think the future is bright for the Innovation Center, but most importantly, I think it is going to bring improvements in the lives of so many of our neighbors at home. And when you look at some of the demonstration projects underway right now, I think that's very telling. The CBO had previously advised us that one of the primary drivers increases in Medicare spending is the aging population and this huge baby boom generation as we see more and more people retire. Is that correct?
Yes, that remains correct.
So if we're going to strengthen Medicare, this is going to be hard work. This is pretty daunting to look at this huge baby boom generation, all these new retirees and what they're going to do to call on Medicare. So it's very welcome that we now have this movement across the country to move to a value-based system over volume, as Mr. Pasquale said, looking at quality over quantity in order to reduce spending. And so many of we really have at our fingertips the best of modern medicine that we can now put to work in Medicare. But I have to disagree with the chairman when he says the Congress would be the best suited to do this. The Congress simply does not have the capacity to do all of the type of studies and innovative work that's going on, and I'll give you a few examples. And think of the CMMI as this new R&D center for Medicare that is needed. Right now, they have entered into a public-private partnership with the YMCA that has now predicts that we are going to be able to achieve over $2,600 in savings by helping older Americans not develop type 2 diabetes, by encouraging them and educating them to exercise a little bit and avoid certain foods in their diets. They're doing the same kind of innovative projects for cardiovascular disease. I know of one at home in Tampa that is going to help us save money when it comes to preventing babies born prematurely, preterm births, which is a growing health problem that has significant consequences for families and is an estimated cost to society of at least $20 billion a year. Each year, this is more than 500,000 infants in the United States, a number that has grown by 36% over the last 20 years. So the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, in partnership with the March of Dimes, in partnership with our local hospitals now, are developing the best advice for families on how to take a birth to full term and not be born prematurely. This is simply not within the purview of Congress to do this type of volume of innovative projects that's necessary. But that doesn't mean that Congress doesn't have a role. I also question the scope of the Medicare Part D demonstration, but that's the Congress's role to be able to communicate with HHS and CMMI, and to bring legislation when we want certain changes. But if we're going to put pressure on Medicare to reduce spending, but also improve health outcomes for families across this country, it's not as simple as just saying, well, we're going to do away with the CMMI. We don't like some of the things they're doing. That's not a smart approach, and it certainly isn't smart to say the approach is simply to give older Americans a voucher and they're on their own. That doesn't do anything to reduce spending. That will simply shift the cost, shift spending, the burden to our parents and our grandparents. And I think it's worth reminding everyone, if you would, Mr. Hadley, if my GOP friends are successful in repealing this R&D center, the innovation center, what cost would that bring to Medicare? What do you predict? What is your estimate right now? If you repeal the CMMI, what is the bottom line cost that you're estimating right now?
The specific estimate would depend on the specifics of the legislation and how it was implemented, but I can say that the current estimate for the savings that we expect to generate from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation is $34 billion.
Say it louder, say it again.
$34 billion over the period from 2017 to 2026.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Black, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Hadley, for being here today on what is, I think, a very important conversation. I want to turn the direction of this just a little bit, perhaps because of my healthcare background, and talk a little bit more about the quality. As you, in your original opening statements, acknowledge that this program was set up to reduce spending, to find savings, but at the same time, making sure that the quality of care was there. So if I understand correctly, CMMI may only expand those demonstrations that maintain or improve quality of care. So let me ask you this, how does CBO build into its estimates of the CMMI savings? How does that build the quality issue into its savings?
We first looked at the historical performance of demonstrations before the center was established, and then we focus more heavily on savings, right, because we're focused on the budgetary effects. But to the extent that the quality effects of previous demonstrations had a feedback on savings, those were taken into account by starting with a historical perspective.
So does the CBO consider the possibility that a demonstration will be terminated because even though it saves money, it lowers the quality of care?
We're counting on that. That there need to be significant numbers of demonstrations that fail. We would expect many, or most, in fact, of the demonstrations to be canceled.
So how does this impact CBO's estimates of an individual CMMI proposal?
Well, for an individual proposal to change an individual demonstration project, we would first look to what we can know about that specific demonstration, and that would come from many sources. First, we'd look to the scientific literature about that type of approach. We would consider both the tool that CMMI proposes to use and the target that the opportunity for savings that they would look to.
So in that case, let's look at the case of the Part B demonstration that's proposed by the CMMI. The evidence shows that this will likely lead to further consolidation among providers and serve to increase cost as patients move from a clinical to a hospital setting to receive their cancer care, specifically chemotherapy. I want to know, and as a matter of fact, one study said this phenomenon, which is already occurring due to other factors, would cost Medicare program $2 billion in 2014 alone. So does CBO take into account this real-world economic impact that occurs as a result of mandatory demonstrations at CBO, like the Part B demonstration?
Yes, we're looking at proposals involving the Part B demonstration. We haven't completed our work in that area yet. Some of the things that make that one more difficult than others to assess are it's very large relative to the size of some other demonstrations. The parameters of the demonstration have only been announced in a notice of proposed rulemaking, so we don't know what the final parameters of the program will look like exactly. And then because it's so large, we also have to think very carefully about the substitution that would occur. That is, if the CMMI, in the context of a CMMI project, if that project were to be blocked by the Congress or by the courts or anyone else, we would expect that CMMI would then pursue other projects and that there would be savings from those other projects, and that should be credited effectively to the bill that is also attributed as the cost of the program. That is, we consider all of the budgetary effects of legislation as it interacts with CMMI.
So if we find in our estimation and our studies, and we're already hearing from our seniors about how this is going to impact them and their quality of care, if we were to submit something to make that change, then you would have to make, you would have to give us back a cost to be able to do that. Is that not correct? Because you've already assumed that there's X number of savings, and if we make any changes, then those changes are going to result in a pay-for on our part to make those changes. Is that not correct?
Well, for proposals that we don't know anything about, we have to assume that they would be kind of a generic proposal that would have that feature. For proposals that we know more about, we're going to follow the information that's available as far as it can lead us before we make any determination.
Well,
So
here-
with the Part B demonstration, we're looking very carefully at what we know about that demonstration to figure out what the budgetary effects would be.
Well, herein lies the problem with Congress not having a role in changing something that we know and see that is not working or cannot work or is going to decrease quality to our constituency, that we then can't make that change because it's going to be a cost to it. And I think that's part of this hearing, is to figure out how do we fix that?
Yeah,
Thank you. I yield back.
Kelly's time has expired. Thank you so much. Gentleman from Washington State, Dr. McDermott is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To follow up on Ms. Black, I have trouble, this is so diffuse of a discussion that it's hard to know. So let's stick with one specific. The Part D, or Part B demonstration project, what is it? What's it supposed, how's it working? How's it work?
Well, so what we know about that demonstration is what's been announced in the notice of proposed rulemaking. So it has essentially two phases. The first phase would move the payment that providers receive for administering drugs from the average sales price plus 6% to a new formula that would be the average sales price plus 1% plus another, but it's lower than 6%, plus a fee that's based, and it's a fixed fee based on the number of times the service is delivered. And the center designed that adjusted fee to be neutral in terms of the overall payments, except that they expect there to be some behavioral response, because for very expensive drugs, the total amount that's provided for administering those drugs will be substantially lower because they're more sensitive to the adjustment in the percentages based on price.
And has that program actually gone into effect?
No.
So all of this blowback we're getting in this committee is from the industry or from the providers who are telling us it's going to cost way more, it's a terrible program, they never should have been implemented or never should have been created in the first place. Is that correct? There's no evidence that this is going to cost more, that it wouldn't have savings.
There's considerable uncertainty about the estimate. We haven't completed our estimate yet.
You haven't even completed it. So we're attacking something that isn't even done yet.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I'm not talking about cost and savings, because they're going to show that there's a savings, at least what the projected is at this point in time. I'm talking about quality
Okay.
and how it will move
I
someone.
take your point. Thank you.
Yield back.
And so, but I'm just talking cost at the moment. We'll talk quality in a second. So this is not yet on the boards. It's not actually working. And the anticipation by the providers and by the pharmaceutical companies and whoever is that it is going to lower quality while it saves money. They admit it'll save money, but they think it'll lower quality. Is that correct?
I don't know.
You don't know what the arguments are.
I haven't followed their specific arguments. We've been following the evidence that's known about them.
When will, if we follow the normal process here, how long would it be before this demonstration project ever got out on the road and got implemented?
So the demonstration was, we expected to be starting in, I think, 2017, but we expected there to be a final rule by now, so we're not exactly sure what the timing of the rollout of that proposal will be.
And then, as a data gatherer, I mean, as a physician, I know you can't make any decision on one point. I mean, one blood pressure doesn't tell anything. You gotta take it several times to see whether it goes up or goes down, right? And so how many data points do you need before you can say this has actually saved money?
Well, you're quite right that we need to look at the available evidence for each project, and that's one of the reasons why for each project as it's being evaluated, it takes many years, and that's why we expect that the center would have, for any given set of projects started in 1 year, it would take them a long time, many years before they knew which projects were succeeding and which projects were failing.
So it might, I mean, this may be a little tough to characterize it this way, but this is killing the baby in the nursery before the baby ever gets up and gets out and goes to school and becomes a human being and does anything. It's deciding something before it has ever had a chance to be put in place and actually work. Is that correct?
It has not yet, the Part B demonstration has not yet been implemented.
And this hearing is basic, and that's, Mr. Chairman, that's my problem with this. We're killing something before we even give it a chance to try. Because somebody out there, I don't know who it is, has come running in here and said, this is going to destroy quality in healthcare, and none of us want to do that. But we don't even know what it is that we're killing.
Gentlemen's time has expired. I would point you to the National Quality Forum work that was done to demonstrate that the work on diabetes, in fact, has increased mortality, increased hospital admissions, and you and I, if we were to work together on this from a quality standpoint and propose it to CBO would tell us that whatever we did would cost money, regardless of the merits of it, because the CMMI, if it was going to save money and increase quality, they would already come up with it. That's the concern that the chairman has. Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Renacci, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. You know, it's interesting as I listen to all the testimony, this discussion really isn't about the Affordable Care Act. This discussion is really about a program, and it's a program that was established by the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Chairman, I want to submit for the record an article by the National Review. Obamacare's crown jewel loses luster. And I want to just read a couple paragraphs. Congress established CMMI in the Obamacare statute with the goal of finding ways to reduce federal spending on medical care without diminishing its quality. That, of course, is the responsibility of Congress, which created the Medicare program and which alone bears responsibility for making legislative changes to it. But Congress chose to outsource some of its core constitutional responsibilities. It gave CMMI $10 billion and a broad license to conduct demonstration projects. It went further, allowing the HHS secretary to expand a demonstration program nationwide if it is proven to save money in a test of limited scope. Such nationwide expansion is the practical equivalent of amending the Medicare statute, a constitutional prerogative reserved to Congress. And I think the question really comes down to, I think you've already answered this, but your CBO has said that if we spend $10 billion, we're going to save $27 billion, correct? Over 10 years.
So our expectation is that it's $10 billion a year, but the first $10 billion tranche was provided for 2011 through 19, and so the next one is in 2020. Over the 2017 to 2026 period, we expect that total spending, the total savings that will be generated from that will be about $34 billion.
Okay, so they're going to spend 10 to save 34. That's what your estimates are. Just ballpark.
It's going to be a little bit larger than 10 because they have some money left over from earlier years.
I doubt you could get any member on this panel to give you $1,000 to save $3,400 just based on what you're saying, because you have not given any specifics. And anybody who says they would has to be lying, because, you know, it gets back to the same old thing. The American people, I just spent 6 weeks back in my district. The American people are not real happy with the spending habits of Washington. And now we've given $10 billion more in spending, And we said that CBO said magically now you're saying 34 billion in savings. American people don't buy it. They're sick and tired. And by the way, they don't think the government is an innovation box. They think the government is a loss box. Everything that they spend is just losing and losing and losing. So it's not about what we think. It's about what the American people think. And the American people are losing faith in this spending habit that Washington has. And so am I, by the way. I was in the healthcare profession for 28 years. I dealt with Medicare and Medicaid. I was in the long-term care profession. I see all this going on. If you want to get an innovation box, there's plenty of them out there. They're called states. We have 50 states that would be great innovation boxes for some testing of Medicare and Medicaid spending. And of course, there are some companies out there that would be great. Anytime you start putting this money into the government's hands, people back home aren't happy. And that's really what we need to look at. We need to focus on this isn't a Republican issue, this isn't a Democrat issue, it's a spending issue. And we need to make sure that the spending methodology and the spending of $10 billion we're getting a return on. And you're saying we can, but nobody here knows how you're getting those numbers. In fact, that's the biggest issue I have. In one way, you say that you know that we're going to save this money, but in the other end, you don't tell us how you're going to spend it. You're just saying, rely on me, rely on us. CBO is estimating this. I got a question. I want to go back to the Part B demonstration that my colleague from Washington State spoke of. One study said the phenomenon, which is already occurring due to other factors, will cost the Medicare program $2 billion in 2014 alone. We haven't started this process, but people are already concerned about it. Does CBO take into account this real-world economic impact that occurs as a result of mandatory demonstrations at CBO like the Part B demonstration? And would the CMS chief actuary consider such factors in determining costs or savings of the demonstration?
So
I'm talking about
CBO
outside studies.
So CBO would certainly consider the outside study when we look at our estimates of what's happening under current law and when we consider our estimates of legislation involving a particular study. I can't speak to what the CMS actuary would consider.
What portion of CMMI savings comes from mandatory demonstrations?
So we haven't broken that out specifically. It's a significant portion, but we expected when the CMMI legislation was enacted that the center would pursue projects that were designed to have rigorous demonstrations. So it's consistent with that expectation.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Ryan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Hadley, for being here. I think this is a really interesting conversation because we're trying to figure out, and when we put this into the Affordable Care Act, we're trying to figure out how to innovate in government. And as Mr. Renacci said, most people don't expect us to do that. But I think it is a frustration in the country that we have not been innovating in a way that we need to be. And I want to commend you, and I want to commend the leadership for putting this in here. I think what the President's doing with manufacturing institutes, for example, is a way to figure out how do we have public-private partnerships where we innovate in manufacturing, and I'm biased, one's in my district, with 3D printing and additive manufacturing to drop the cost of manufacturing, use less materials, and save the government money. And the main example I like to use is for the F-16s. I think it's the F-16s. If we drop the plane by 1 pound, we save $1 billion in fuel over the life of the plane. So here we are in healthcare trying to figure out something that's even more complicated than an airplane, the human being, and figure out how to make us healthier and how to create a system or innovate within a system that can keep us healthier so we don't spend as much money on our own health care, so that we free money up in Medicare and Medicaid so we have money to invest in infrastructure and innovation in other areas and grow the economy and balance budgets and all the rest. It's going to take something like this in order for us to check it out and what works and what doesn't work. And I would think that my friends on the Republican side would be very, very supportive of this. We're innovating in government. We're trying to make government run more efficiently. We don't know exactly how to do that yet in healthcare because there's so many different approaches. And again, it's our human bodies. It's very complicated and a very complicated system. But we're trying to figure it out. And so I think $10 billion in a $1 trillion plus budget is a very, very small price to pay for us to figure out how to reduce diabetes in the Medicare program, which I see there's a adoption of best practices for Medicare and trying to figure out through coaching and different programs how to reduce diabetes. And you know, Mr. Hadley, that diabetes is a very, very expensive thing to treat. You stay in the hospital an extra day, day and a half. If you have diabetes and something else, the cost of your health care, if you have heart disease and diabetes or high blood pressure and diabetes, increases. And we've heard several times on the other side about, well, states should do this. The Medicare, Medicaid enrollee pilot program that you're trying to do, where you coordinate Medicare and Medicaid benefits. We have states that are adopting and trying to integrate, and Washington State's already saying that they're showing reductions in monthly Medicare costs per beneficiary. I don't have a particular question for you, but I do want to make the point that we've got to get out of this mentality. You know, we all want to balance the budget. How? A third of the budget's Medicare and Medicaid. Healthcare costs continue to go up. I mean, 10 to 20%, the premiums. They were going up 50, 60% a few years ago prior to the Affordable Care Act. Guys, we've got to innovate. We've got to spend a little bit of money from the government side to figure out how to do all this better. We can't keep going that the private market is not going to do it. If they keep getting paid for doing the same thing, they're going to keep doing the same thing and keep getting paid and keep making a lot of money. We're trying to figure out, is it healthy lifestyles? How do you integrate these? But we're going to have to try a lot of different things. We didn't go to the moon in 3 months. It took us a decade, and people died, and we made mistakes, and some money was wasted. But we got there. And the benefits of that, we're still experiencing today in our economy. So I appreciate what you're doing. I think this is a phenomenal program. I think we need more money in a program like this. We need more pilots. We need to, quite frankly, make more mistakes so we can figure out exactly what we need to do to make this stuff work. I don't run from this. I think this is a phenomenal, innovative program, and we should have something like this in all areas of government. How do we make it work better? And let's not be afraid to make a few mistakes along the way.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Johnson from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hadley, looks like you get the Ohio trifecta here all in a row. So I appreciate you being here with us today. You know, very, very complex situation that we deal with CMMI. I understand that CMMI operates within a set of guardrails or guidelines, and that observance of those guardrails should also have a factor into CBO's budgetary assumptions. So, you know, you look at some of those guardrails or guidelines, things like demonstration projects that could be scientifically evaluated using appropriate research methods, including requirements for sample sizes large enough to allow statistical analysis, giving the Secretary of HHS the authority to modify and refine the models being tested, an incentive for the Secretary to end unsuccessful models if they're not working. So who ultimately determines if CMMI is operating within the boundaries of those guidelines? Is it Congress? Is it the Secretary? Who is it?
Well, ultimately, it's the Congress and the American people.
Okay, so what happens if Congress looks at one of those demonstration projects and says it's not being operated within the guidelines and try to change it? What assumptions do the CBO make when that happens?
We would first look to what we know about that specific project, about the specific tools that are being employed by the center to conduct the project, and the specific opportunities for savings that the specific demonstration targets. We would look to see if how the legislation that the Congress is considering, how it would interact with the center and potentially with that project or other projects, and then also think about how it affects the project as a whole.
But it's my understanding that when Congress does that, it's considered a cost additive, right? Is that?
Well, in total, we
understanding?
expect that this center will produce savings. And so in expectation, we think that we have to assign to projects about which we know nothing or very little, we have to assume that they are some share of the overall savings. But once we know something more specific about an individual project, then we can evaluate based on the facts of that project.
Well, who reviews and certifies the demos that are proposed and acted on by CMMI?
So the CMMI looks at the demonstration to determine quality, and the Medicare actuary then looks at the demonstration to ensure that it would not increase spending.
So, wait a minute, if I heard what you just said correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, CMMI proposes the project and CMMI reviews and certifies the project?
Yes,
That's
that's
the
correct.
fox in the henhouse. Who else looks at the project to see that they're within the guardrails, within the guidelines, and whether or not they're achieving success or failure?
Well, the Congress, the stakeholders, our sister agencies, and we would all look at the available evidence about that. And we would also look very closely at the evaluation that the center uses when it's evaluating the program. And so
Right.
we may be very critical of some of the assumptions they make or of the scope of their projects.
Well, let me ask you this. Let's say a demo is not in compliance with those guardrails, and Congress acts to scale back or stop the demo. What's the result of CBO's perspective?
So we haven't faced that situation yet, but if there was a demonstration that we believed increased cost and the Congress were to stop that demonstration from continuing, then we would expect that the legislation, depending on its parameters, would likely result in increased savings.
I'm not sure I understood what you just said, but let me go back to a different question here. Do your assumptions about savings change as demos progress and experience success or failure? I mean, over the life of a project, you're going to either achieve success or failure. Do your assumptions about savings change as a result of that?
Our assumption is that for any particular set of demonstrations, that the unsuccessful ones will be terminated within 2 to 5 years, and then it'll take some period longer before the administration decides whether to expand the successful demonstrations.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Norcross from New Jersey, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. Heard a lot of testimony today. We understand the need for what is driving this issue is certainly cost. In the balance is our oversight. And you really can't answer this directly, but I'm concerned with the pilot program and demonstration project, the size, where it might create winners and losers because of geographical concerns. And I'm not sure how you would score that, not knowing the size or the shape of the demonstration project itself. You're trying to put a cost-driving savings on that. But more importantly is that creates winners and losers when it comes to patients. One area would be saddled with the cost drivers, that is CMMI's proposal, and one wouldn't. And we're very much waiting to hear how that geographically is broken out. But I guess what you can answer is how can you take into account what areas would be included and what wouldn't? How do you assess a savings or a cost to that?
So I think it's important to understand that CBO provides budget and economic information to the Congress, but the Congress has a much broader set of requirements. And so concerns about quality, concerns about equity, concerns about the proper role of the executive branch versus the legislative branch. Those are all very important questions, but they're outside of CBO's purview. But when we look at individual demonstrations, we look to see how they are designed and what we know about them in particular. And one can easily imagine one that was focused on specific geographic areas. We would have some concerns about that from the perspective of its ability to achieve savings nationwide. If a demonstration that was focused in only one geographic area that then did not share the characteristics of the nation as a whole, you would expect a different result. Don't know what that would be, but it would be different than the results that you got in the first demonstration. And so we would have concerns about the extent to which those, the results from that demonstration could be generalized to the nation as a whole.
So how do you assess the value?
Well, so then that again would depend on what we knew about that specific demonstration, the extent to which we had available information. It might be that under those circumstances, we wouldn't expect any additional savings. But again, it would depend all on the specifics.
So the less information you have, the less accurate it would be in essence.
That's correct. Until we have more evidence, our estimates are going to remain highly uncertain in that area of savings.
Sure. Thank you. I have no additional questions.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Westerman, Arkansas, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Hadley, for being here today. Had we been given a copy of your work and the model you used to evaluate CMMI, the answer to my questions might be self-evident, but since we don't have that, hopefully you'll be able to provide some answers and explain. And when I hear about all of the great things that are happening as a result of CMMI and your rave reviews of cost savings and better quality, it makes me wonder if my congressional district might exist in some alternative universe, because that's just the opposite of what's happening back at home. I could give you lots of examples. I've got a border county with Louisiana, a rural area, has one hospital there because of a Medicare program. The closest ambulance service is in Louisiana, but they don't want to come across the state line to transport patients, so the one ambulance service in that county eats the cost when they go outside of a 35-mile radius to transport somebody to the hospital. So my question is, does your analysis make any provisions for rural versus urban areas?
So we would look at specific demonstrations to the extent that that's been an area of focus of the center, then we would expect there to be more demonstrations in that area. To the extent that the center hasn't pursued very many demonstrations that are focused on rural areas, then that would be an opportunity for future demonstrations.
So you haven't had many demonstrations, but you're projecting a huge cost savings from the result of CMMI. So that leads me to some specific questions. That these are practical things that I hear when I'm back home. Does your analysis consider any cost to Medicare on hospitalization when durable medical equipment money is saved by not allowing home delivery of any diabetic test strips?
So when we considered the demonstration that involved durable medical equipment, we looked at all of the information that was available to us, all of the evidence about the overall effects of spending, but I don't know more about the specifics of that demonstration.
I mean, this is a real-life problem where rural patients can't get diabetic test strips delivered because of some cost-saving program. Does your analysis consider overall cost to Medicare on hospitalization versus the savings on durable medical equipment when a competitive bid walker is drop-shipped to a rural patient and it has to be assembled by the patient?
Again, we only looked at the overall effect, and I don't have the specifics for that specific demonstration.
So you don't have any real-world experiences like that, yet you're able to project that this program's saving money for the federal government, plus providing better quality services?
So our estimates are based on the historical performance of demonstrations before the center was established and the expectation that the center will cancel the demonstrations that do not produce savings or that harm quality.
Does your analysis consider cost to Medicare hospitalization when DME saves money by not allowing companies to clean and service oxygen concentrators for home health patients?
So our overall estimates of Medicare would consider that kind of evidence, and and we'd be happy to look at it if.
You probably haven't looked at that so far.
I don't know. I assume our analysts have, and I will check with them.
Yeah, we don't know what you've looked at because we don't have a copy of the model. Does your analysis consider the poor health outcomes and increased hospitalization costs when rack audits to meet a quota prevent payment on a pair of orthopedic shoes for a diabetic patient?
The model looks at a more general approach because we don't know enough about specific demonstrations to be able to make specific estimates of a generic demonstration going forward. So I'm not sure which demonstration project that CMMI is concluding that connects to.
So do you see the disconnect when I go home and talk to my constituents and I hear these are real examples? Every one of these are things that I've had brought to my attention, that I've had meetings on with people in my district, and then to come here and see a report that says that because of CMMI and these demonstration projects and some of these things that have been implemented, we're providing lower cost health care and we're providing better health care. And that's certainly not what's happening in my district.
I understand your concern, Congressman, and I appreciate that the Congress is charged with a much broader set of responsibilities than CBO. Our role is to provide our best estimate of the likely savings or costs of legislation.
And my point is I don't think you're taking into account all of the situations that exist out there in the real world when you're making this analysis. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I won't use all 5. I wasn't chiming in here until I heard the gentleman from California. So if I were to drop a bill in this afternoon that would appropriate $1 billion or whatever amount, which would read simply as follows: be it hereby resolved, we wish to eliminate all waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. How would you score that?
The difficulty with estimating a proposal like that is we don't know this, how that would be achieved. We hope that the administration, that any administration is doing what they can to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. So it's difficult to operationalize legislation like that without more specifics.
If we put the specific in an efficient manner and with quality control, would that be sufficient for you to score it then?
No, Congressman.
So then how in the world are you able to score what's being done here, what the gentleman from California was questioning about, where there are absolutely no specifics? Your answer to him was, we are going to look back to see how other studies have been done in other areas. Why wouldn't you do it in this case?
So the situation you describe is a little bit different than what we expect from CMMI. The process that the center has for conducting rigorous
Okay, we'll put another
analysis.
line in it and say we're creating a brand new agency to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, to adopt the procedures that have been used by other agencies to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse and such in the government. Is that necessary? Is that do it?
No, Congressman.
So there seems to be the rub, and that's why I wasn't going to chime in here until I realized that the CBO, which I once respected as this bipartisan group that you could look to for factual information, has now become something of an Alice in Wonderland looking through the window, the rabbit hole, as far as getting information out of it. What about if I set it up to a committee that's established the money to go back to Congress and set up all the exact parameters, any language that you want that CMI currently uses, okay, that you say that you would look to see how they do it, but say that it's being done by Congress through the legislative branch. We are here appropriating money to the Budget Committee to come up with eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, but we're going to follow all the parameters, any one you wanted that CMI is using. How would you score that?
If the Congress provided legislation that was identical in terms of scope of authority to the administration, then it would receive the same score that we have under current law. So one of the differences from the situation described before is the ability to rigorously test demonstrations and then the
But you're not
requirement to stop.
there is no rigorous testing because you've already admitted the fact that you're giving a cost savings to this even before you know what the project is. There is no cost-benefit analysis. There is no testing done. You don't even know what they're going to be looking at. But you're saying this is going to save $34 billion. That, sir, sounds absolutely absurd to me and anyone who is looking at that you can say that without a language on a piece of paper, what they're going to do, what they're going to study, how they're going to study it, where they're going to do it, but somehow or other you, in your wisdom, know that that's going to provide $34 billion. Let me ask you another question. Right now, when the administration proposes rules, when the rule is initially proposed, you look at it, and if it's specific enough, you can say, here are the cost savings, and you will put 50%, not 100%, into the CBO baseline. This is your procedure, right? And then if Congress, before it is actually finalizing the rule, if Congress looks at it and says, we don't really think on it, bipartisan approach, we don't think this is a good thing, maybe for quality control reasons or something like that, we come together, we want to put in legislation that would change it, you would find that as a cost to the program if we eliminate that program because you put in a cost savings, correct? You can say yes, because that is a procedure.
So for most rules that the administration considers, they are part of the baseline. They're part of the expectation that
In the
CBO
proposed
has.
rules, right.
Right. They're already part of, and so when they issue those rules, there's no change to the baseline. When there is a notice of proposed rulemaking that is substantially different than what CBO
Right.
expected, then we would assume that there is going to be a change in behavior, and there is the 50%.
Right, and that's exactly what I
probability.
said. So you put it in, and you put the cost savings in, and if we try to change that before the finalized rules, you say, no, that's going to cost Congress, even though in many cases there's not a finalized rules and it doesn't go into effect. Isn't that true?
That is correct. That's
So
the
in other
procedure
words,
that we looked at
Congress
in the
is
budget committee.
penalized for doing something, trying to work in a bipartisan manner in between, just because you added it to the baseline initially, even though there was no finalized rule. Isn't that true? The
Gentlemen,
answer is yes.
gentlemen's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing, and Mr. Hadley, thank you for being here. I want to go back to something my friend Mr. Ryan said. He said, I would expect Republicans to support innovation. I want to go on the record. I expect with 99% of my colleagues supporting innovation. What I would hope that all Democrats would oppose is the delegation of lawmaking authority to non-lawmakers. And what I heard in the conversation you had with Mr. Garrett is that if Congress were to pass a bill that said we're going to eliminate waste, fraud, abuse, or even more specifically, we're going to innovate in the space of Medicare and Medicaid, you would not put a big score on that because maybe we'll be successful at that or maybe we won't. But in the case of CMMI, Congress has delegated not just the ability to study it, but the ability to change the entire law relative to it. And so now the folks who are out there doing the work can actually make conduct the study and then make the long-term policy. Am I understanding why this score has come out the way it has?
Yes, that's correct.
And are you seeing more of that? I mean, I think about the Congress saying, well, we can't solve the financial services space, so we're going to delegate all that authority to the CFPB and let them fix it because we can't do it. And now I see folks seeming to celebrate delegating this authority to CMMI. If we'd gone a different direction, if instead the legislation had said, we want you to go out there and test and bring back to us what works and what doesn't, and then we will pass enacting legislation in a bipartisan way to implement that, would we have gotten the same big score for the creation of CMMI?
You would have gotten some savings. I mean, it would depend on the specifics of how the proposal was written, but you would have gotten some savings for the projects that succeeded. And importantly, I'm assuming that that proposal would also allow the center to early on cancel those projects that were not succeeding in improving quality or reducing spending.
When you talk about going
Will
out,
gentleman yield for just
Be
10
happy to
seconds?
yield.
I just think what his point was is that we can't function quick enough, which is, I hope we all could agree that government doesn't function quick enough. Congress functions even more slowly than government agencies. What he's trying to say is we can cut waste. If their program's not working, boom, we can cut it and focus on what's working. I think that's a benefit. That's, I think, what we're trying to do.
I fear that my friend is right, and that as I talk to voters out there, what they really want these days is a benevolent dictator, because benevolent dictators can move very quickly, and they can get a lot of good work done in a very short period of time.
We're not allowing him to send troops off anywhere. We're just talking about an innovative program within healthcare.
And it pains me that you and I, as lawmakers, celebrate the success of failing to do our responsibility, and not just failing at it, but quitting at it and delegating it to someone else who can. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, Mr. Hadley, but when you talk about looking at comparative literature in this space, when CMMI changes the way that they reimburse for 75% of our cancer patients in this country, now there are 55 million folks on on Medicare, so we're talking about 41 million plus, if we take 75% of that. How much competitive literature did you look at where folks were doing innovation studies with a pool of, say, 41 million plus people?
It's very hard to find any
In fact,
literature that's
none.
on that scale.
Hard to find any. There are absolutely none, because it ceases to be an innovative study and it begins to be a change in public policy. And when I look at how to bring folks together, certainly innovation is that bond that unites us. Delegating lawmaking authority to any administration should offend us at a First Amendment level. It's not a CBO problem. That's not a First Amendment, an Article 1 issue. That's a congressional problem. Tell me this: when does CBO change from looking at competitive literature to looking at the actual work that's being done? You might have looked at competitive literature to say this is how much money CMI is going to save. Now CMI is doing all of these destructive things that Mr. Westerman just described. His constituents obviously disadvantaged by this. When do you cease to look at the competitive literature and begin to look at what you suggested, Mr. Westerman, you had not looked at yet, and that's the real-life experience that his constituents are having?
So we're always kind of in the market to gather that information. We always want to receive it, and we consider it. The problem that we have at this stage is that in many cases we don't have enough of the current information to be able to make much of an assessment.
So despite the fact that here we are in September with Mr. Westerman and Ms. Black and member after member after member talking about real-life negative consequences, not just negative cost consequences, but negative health care consequences, when we get back together next spring to write the next budget and we go over to CBO for estimates, you would expect to still be using the comparative studies.
That's correct.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Chairman.
I want to remind folks we'll have a second panel. I want to thank Mr. Hadley for appearing with us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing, and that those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal record, and any member who wishes to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. I want to thank you, Mr. Hadley, for joining us. I want to it hurts me to have members of this committee express concerns about the objectivity of the Congressional Budget Office. I hope it hurts you. And I would ask you to take back to the Congressional Budget Office the concerns that you heard by members from this committee about that objectivity, and take to heart those concerns. We do not delight in bringing this before the public. And I'm hopeful that we can work together to once again restore CBO's reputation as a nonpartisan, objective body, and look forward to working with Mr. Yarmouth on that as well. Thank you, Mr. Hadley. We appreciate you joining us today. We are going to invite the second panel up, and while we're doing that, we're still working on these cameras, and we will take a 3-minute recess to try to reboot the cameras, and urge members to stick around.
Looks exactly like Pat Sajak.
He does. You know what I've often wondered about, and I've been in this room many times, I've never heard why whoever that is has that white background. That's a horrible picture.
That's not a good one, no, that's
Terrible. And they all know what all the pictures look like, so that's a bad choice. Maybe he's not the operator.
yeah, right. It's a shroud.
It's a shroud.
Hi, I'm Topher Spiro.
Hey, Mark Madden, how you doing?
You're from Virginia?
Yep. Just outside, my practice is out in Reston, but we kind of take care of the entire state, really. We got North Virginia, Richmond, we got Lynchburg, we're talking to some other groups around. Just kind of
You're in BPCI and CGI?
Committee will come to order. Want to welcome our second panel to this hearing, this important hearing. We appreciate your patience through the first panel. Dr. Antos, Dr. Madden, Mr. Spiro, and Mr. Okon, we thank you for your time today, and we welcome you. The committee has received your written statements, and without objection will be made part of the formal hearing record. You'll each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and Dr. Antos, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Yarmouth, and members of the committee for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. I'm currently at the American Enterprise Institute. I was previously Assistant Director for Health and Human Resources at CBO, and earlier I was Director of the Office of Research and Demonstrations in what is now known as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Given my experience, I agree that demonstration projects can be a useful tool in testing alternative policies that could improve healthcare delivery and slow cost growth. I also support CBO's role in providing budgetary analysis to inform Congress as it considers new legislation, but I am acutely aware of the limitations that research and budget analysis have in projecting the future impact of new approaches on the health system and health spending. I will highlight 5 points from my testimony today. First, the Affordable Care Act transferred extraordinary power to set policy for some of our nation's most important and costly public programs. CMMI can test new payment and delivery models, including models that mandate participation by healthcare providers, without specific direction from Congress. Moreover, the Secretary of HHS can expand the scope and duration of a model that HHS decides is successful in phase 2 testing without congressional approval. Such testing can be mandatory, nationwide, and with no time limits. That constitutes a fundamental shift from Congress to the executive branch in the ability to make policy. Second, CBO plays an important role in estimating the budget impact of proposed legislation, but it has taken an approach that effectively protects CMMI from congressional actions that would alter ongoing and future demonstration projects. CBO stated last year that it will account for savings that might be lost for initiatives CMMI is undertaking, and I emphasize, or is expected to undertake, in assessing legislative proposals. This remarkable decision to score lost savings for demonstration projects that have not yet been announced is a sharp break with past practice. CBO releases formal cost estimates for legislative proposals only after the proposal has been marked up. The scores are based on legislative language rather than general descriptions. In the case of CMMI projects, CBO apparently is content to provide scores based on informal discussions, information that is not publicly available, and general ideas that might be tested at some point in the future, but that have not been developed into a concrete proposal. As a result, congressional proposals to modify a CMMI project or to initiate a new project that is not currently underway through CMMI, but could be at some time in the future, are likely to be scored as increased federal spending. That is the case even when the legislation is designed to reduce spending. Third, CBO admits that it does not have sufficient information to provide accurate 10-year cost estimates of CMMI projects. Most of those projects have been operating for only a short time, and CMS has been slow in releasing data on their performance. Consequently, these speculative cost estimates are based on the assumption that CMMI and HHS will accurately identify cost-saving projects and expand them. I certainly hope that would be the case, but I found that, in my own experience, that demonstration projects were more likely to identify what not to do rather than what to do. Fourth, even when there is information from CMMI on the operation of its projects, evaluating their success is complicated and likely to produce ambiguous results. In my testimony, I go over a recent study by Harvard professor Ashish Jha, who essentially points out that although the CMS press release says that the Medicare Shared Savings Program saved over $1 billion last year, in fact, it lost $216 million for taxpayers. Clearly, deciding whether a demonstration project is a success is not an easy task. Importantly, whether there appear to be savings or not depends on decisions made by CMMI about the benchmark or other aspects of the demonstration project that may be seriously flawed. We cannot be sure that HHS will be able to correctly decide which initiatives will reduce program spending if expanded in phase 2 testing. Fifth and last, the ACA's transfer of authority to the executive branch is a dangerous precedent. This is not a partisan issue. Members of both parties have raised concerns about CMMI's Part B drug payment model. Although finding a savings offset to legislation that would modify that project could be difficult, that's not the fundamental issue. What is at stake is the separation of powers between the executive and the Congress. If Congress wants to regain its proper authority, it will have to take action. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Antos. Dr. Madden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Price, Congressman Yarmouth, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate your having me here today, and I also want to thank you for just the work you do. I'm far more comfortable putting a hip back together than sitting in this conference room, but you guys do incredible work, so keep it up. My name is Mark Madden. I'm an orthopedic surgeon from Fairfax, Virginia. I'm with Ortho Virginia, an independent physician practice that's a participant in one of the new Medicare payment models developed by CMMI, the Bundled Payments for Care Improvement, or BPCI Model 2. In this, we take responsibility for managing the quality and cost for a Medicare patient during an entire episode of care, both inpatient and outpatient, for up to 90 days after the patient's discharge from the hospital. The goal of the initiative is to transition from Medicare fee-for-service payments to a payment model that rewards quality care for the entire episode. We assume the risk of financial penalties as well as the possibility of bonus payments. We're convened under Signature Medical Group, the only physician-led convener for BPCI Model 2 in orthopedics. We are the largest single clinically integrated orthopedic bundled payment program in the country. We include over 2,000 physicians in 56 practices across 26 states, and we manage 50,000 Medicare joint replacements every year. The results have been dramatic, with reductions in adverse outcomes, including hospital readmissions, surgical site infections, joint infections, and other serious surgical complications. We've also significantly improved patient satisfaction, with rates frequently over 95%. I should point out that BPCI Model 2 is different than the new Comprehensive Care for Joint Replacement, or CJR model. All BPCI initiatives are voluntary, and they can be led by physician groups such as ours, hospitals, or other providers. CJR models, however, can only be led by hospitals, and participation is mandatory for all hospitals in a geographic area chosen by CMS, except for hospitals currently participating in BPCI. The significant problems that we have experienced in BPCI will be even more difficult in a larger mandatory program like CJR unless these problems are corrected early on. Before I discuss these flaws, I want to be clear that I'm not implying that CMMI has been unwilling to engage in dialogue or make changes. We have had numerous discussions with them, and on a series of issues, they have been very open to changes. However, there are areas which we have not reached agreement on that we believe could threaten the viability of bundled payment models in the future. The most significant issue of concern is the National Trend Factor, or NTF, which continuously updates the target prices set by CMS and which the BPCI participants are expected to meet. The second issue of concern is the methodology through which CMS attributes particular items, services, and costs to particular providers. The third issue of concern is the need to coordinate the end of BPCI with the end of CJR. I will focus my remaining time on discussing the NTF and will address the second and third issues in my written statement for the record. BPCI participants receive bonus payments if the total cost of care for the episode is below a target price set by CMS. Conversely, if the total episode cost of care is above the target price, the difference must be paid to CMS. This target price is established using baseline price calculated from the participant's historical costs for all Part A and B. The baseline price is then adjusted by giving CMS a 2% discount, a wage adjustment factor, and the NTF. Unfortunately, how the NTF is calculated is ambiguous at best. CMMI provides very little visibility on the data sources used to create the NTF, even though the financial impact of its application can be quite significant. To date, we have seen the application of the NTF produce unanticipated negative financial consequences to many of our practices, despite clear care improvements and cost savings. To put it simply, despite achieving CMMI's goals for the BPCI initiative on cost and quality, physician practices are being penalized financially, actually losing money on each episode because their gains are outpaced by a downward spiraling NTF. No one in the convening group understands the methodology or data used to calculate these prices, and most of us question their accuracy. In any event, without greater transparency, we cannot adequately plan nor compete. Without assured accuracy, we cannot participate. And if doctors and hospitals are not able to participate, CMS will not realize anticipated cost savings or care improvements. This, of course, is a problem far greater than a budgetary scoring problem. Happily, we believe there are solutions, which I'm submitting for the record in my statement, but they must be resolved before these programs can succeed. I'd like to again thank you for being here. Thank you for your time and your interest in this issue, and I'm happy to respond to any questions as I'm able.
Thanks, Dr. Madden. Mr. Spiro, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Today about CMMI, a vital cost control tool created under the Affordable Care Act. I'd like to begin my testimony with some context. We all know that the rapid growth in healthcare costs is a major long-standing problem. And over the last few years, we have witnessed an extraordinary slowdown in the growth of healthcare costs. Whatever the cause, policymakers must act proactively and with urgency to lock in the slowdown as soon as possible. One approach is to shift costs and risks to beneficiaries, which may prevent them from accessing necessary care. The other approach, which I believe is bipartisan, is to reform the payment and delivery system to reward value and quality. This is why the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation is such an important cost control tool. The center has the authority to test reforms and expand them if they are successful. Thanks to the center, Medicare already makes 30% of payments through alternative payment models, up from none in 2010. At its heart is the concept of evidence-based policymaking, a concept that is common sense and enjoys widespread bipartisan support. Critically, the center must be able to design demonstrations in a way that we can be confident of the results. As the Congressional Budget Office has explained, voluntary demonstrations are subject to selection bias, in which participants may not be representative of most providers. Simply put, it could not have been the intent of Congress to hamstring the center such that results of a demonstration could not be extrapolated. Not only would this have been extremely wasteful, it also would not have adhered to the principles of evidence-based policymaking. But perhaps most importantly, voluntary initiatives are unlikely to drive payment reform. In order to affect spending on a large scale, they must have broad participation. But to attract a significant number of participants, they must reduce the financial risk to participants or increase the financial rewards, which limits the potential savings. Voluntary payment reforms, in other words, are a classic catch-22. This catch-22 is why it was so important that the center launched its first mandatory demonstration, the Comprehensive Joint Replacement Program. According to the Institute of Medicine, spending on post-hospital care is the primary driver of variation in Medicare spending across areas. Bundled payments that include post-acute care, like the CGR demonstration, are therefore key to reducing wasteful Medicare spending. Although the center has not yet reported results from the demonstration, I can relay to you results from one major healthcare system. Northwell Health, which includes 21 hospitals in New York, has boosted the share of patients who are discharged to home rather than to an expensive facility from 30% to about 50%. In addition to services, the center is also addressing drug costs, which represent 20% of Medicare spending. For drugs administered by physicians, Medicare reimburses providers for the average sales price of a drug plus a 6% markup, or 106% of ASP. This formula artificially inflates drug costs for some of the costliest drugs. As a result, Medicare spending on these drugs has increased by more than 10% per year since 2009. To address this problem, the center has proposed reducing the 106% payment. Because average sales price is an average, and the prices can vary around that average, critics are concerned that the proposal will not fully reimburse the cost of drugs for some providers. The variation of prices around the average sales price is an empirical question. For the highest spending drugs, the vast majority of prices are less than 102% of ASP. Thus, a 6% cushion is generally unnecessary and somewhat arbitrary. Moreover, substantial evidence from the real world indicates that drug manufacturers respond to such pricing reforms by lowering prices and narrowing price variation. When it comes to Medicare payment for services and drugs, the status quo is not an option. Although concerns are always raised about the impact of reforms on access to care, we forget that the status quo is what actually threatens access to care by driving up costs and coinsurance payments. Because Congress wisely created the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, it is now much more difficult for special interests that are financed by the drug industry or that financially benefit from the status quo to thwart long overdue reforms. To keep the brake on healthcare costs, the center must be allowed to act with urgency to set expectations about a pathway to payment reform. We simply cannot afford a protracted period of inaction or uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Okon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Price, Mr. Yarmouth, and members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today to the Budget Committee. I am the Executive Director of the Community Oncology Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering quality, affordable, and accessible cancer care to Americans in their own communities. I have submitted extensive written testimony focusing on CMMI, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, and very specifically the proposed Medicare Part B drug payment model, which I will refer to as the Part B model. In my limited time here, I will summarize why this Part B model is bad medicine, flawed economics, and destructive policy. Anyone with an understanding of modern-day cancer care realizes there are very few instances where substitution of a less expensive cancer drug is possible, appropriate, and safe. The Part B model proposes blindly ratcheting down payment for standard of care cancer drugs in order to simply cut costs by trying to force oncologists to use less expensive, older therapies. The Part B model will be conducted as an experiment that randomizes geography to test and control experimental cells with 3/4 of the country in the test cell. The experiment is designed to change clinical decision-making to lower Medicare Part B spending on, or Medicare spending on Part B drugs. However, unlike the accepted rules and ethics of clinical research on human subjects, seniors don't get to opt in. They can't even opt out and receive no informed consent that they are part of a clinical research experiment. It's also alarming that there are no patient safeguards, such as real-time monitoring and reporting of adverse events, outcomes, and quality. This is simply bad medicine. It's important to note that CMS has already conducted an experiment on cancer care delivery by substantially cutting Part B drug reimbursement on 2 previous occasions, in 2005 and 2012. This has resulted in a dramatic shift of cancer care to the more expensive hospital setting. In 2004, 84% of chemotherapy was delivered in independent community cancer clinics, but by 2014, that had fallen to 54%, with the remainder delivered in the far more expensive hospital setting. This shift in the site of care cost Medicare $2 billion more in 1 year alone, 2014, and beneficiaries $500 million more in the same year. The only inescapable conclusion, based on history, is that the Part B model will result in higher cost to Medicare and beneficiaries, as well as increased drug prices. As you can see, the economics of the Part B model are deeply flawed. CMS is using Section 1115A of the Affordable Care Act to effectively overturn legislation that was passed by Congress in 2003 that fixed Medicare Part B reimbursement. If the Part B model is implemented, the executive branch could effectively overturn any Medicare law passed by Congress simply by creating a mandatory national CMMI model. That is exactly what CMS is doing with the Part B model. The Part B model is bad public policy and sets a destructive and devastating precedent. As I have stated publicly many times, and I am doing so again today, I am very concerned about the increased cost of cancer care, especially escalating cancer drug prices. However, to reiterate, the Part B model will not address the problem of cancer drug costs. It will exacerbate it. Frankly, I am stunned that any physician, policymaker, regulator, or expressed advocate for seniors and cancer patients can support what is a clear experiment on patient care without patient knowledge, understanding, and safeguards. The solution to address the cost of cancer drug pricing lies in the same path we have been pioneering in paying for cancer care services, and that is syncing payment with value. However, a rush to do something about drug prices should not be an experiment that clearly presents a danger to senior cancer patients. No one can say that the Community Oncology Alliance is not committed to oncology payment reform. Currently, we have close to 70% of the CMMI oncology care model cancer facilities networked in a cooperative group to share information, enhance cancer delivery, and ensure success of that initiative. Additionally, we are working with private insurers on payment reform pilots and implementation of their oncology payment reform models. We are totally committed to transforming the payment for cancer care, but only with a focus on quality cancer care that places patients first. Unfortunately, the Part B model endangers patient care, will only increase costs to Medicare and its beneficiaries, and sets a terrible precedent that rattles the very foundation of the Constitution. Regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, this should be a grave concern. I thank you and open to any questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank all of you for your testimony. I'm going to mix it up a little bit on this second panel and have others on my side to ask questions before and I recognize the Vice Chairman, Mr. Okita, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony. Dr. Antos, were you here for the first panel?
I was.
Yeah, thank you. Are you familiar with a blog post from 2015 from CBO that talked about CMMI?
Yes, in fact, I quoted it in my remarks.
Okay, apologize. Year after year, we hear that CBO says, in terms of long-term budget outlook, that CMMI's likelihood of actually identifying models that produce savings is uncertain, quote unquote. Yet in that June 5th, 2015 blog post, they were very particular, saying that the program saved $38 billion over a 10-year window for a net savings of $27 billion. Similarly, in the blog post, quote, CBO cannot predict which projects will work, unquote, and yet CBO seems to be able to distinguish the effects of a single model compared to CMMI's baseline. These seem to be contradictory statements. Do you agree, disagree, or can you explain them based on your experience at CBO?
Well, I would say that they are inconsistent with CBO's past practices in providing scores to the Congress for legislation. It seems to me that a mistake was made in 2010. CBO decided to give a score to an activity that frankly wasn't very specified. Yes, there were a couple of pages in the ACA that listed the entire grab bag of ideas that everybody had ever thought of to improve the healthcare system.
Why would they do this?
That's a good question, but they chose to do that, and I believe that since then they have simply been consistent. In other words, the mistake was made in 2010, in my opinion.
And they have to keep following the mistake, so they're consistent in following the mistake.
Yes.
That way. Now, if you're listening to that first panel, then I think you could take away, correct me if I'm wrong, that CBO is assuming that CMMI will operate with perfect efficiency to test and expand programs that generate Medicare savings. What are your observations in this regard? Is CMMI focused on achieving savings, or do you see them pursuing other political interests?
Well, first of all, perfect efficiency is not possible on this earth.
Am I embellishing?
Possibly.
I mean, so do you see in CBO's work that they don't assume perfect efficiency in CMMI?
That's a fair statement. It's a little hard to know what they do assume, but no economist would believe that any activity, either by the government or the private sector, operates on a perfectly efficient basis.
Yet here we are with the CBO doing just that.
Well, CBO is making assumptions without specific information about the projects that are going to be going forward in the future. And as the first panelist said, they are not judging they're not judging these projects on the basis of actual information about what will be coming. They're judging everything on the basis of other projects and other information that occurred in the past.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Okon.
Congressman, my wife's a nurse, and she says there's only one medical professional in the family, and it's definitely not me. So.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Mr. then, sir.
Thank you.
My understanding is CMMI is supposed to target populations with a, quote, deficit of care, unquote. Is 75% of the Part B population experiencing a deficit of care when it comes to Part B drugs?
No, in fact, I would even expand on that in that it says directly in the ACA that evidence that the model addresses a defined population, which 75% is not, for which there are deficits in care leading to poor clinical outcomes or potentially avoidable expenditures. I don't know of any deficits of care. None were mentioned in the rule, specifically with oncology care, leading to either poor clinical outcomes or potentially avoid expenditures, and that's exactly right at the ACA.
So here they are off statute, doing what they want. For what reason do you think?
My opinion, Congressman? Yeah. I think, frankly, that the current administration needs to check the box walking out the door on drug prices, and I think this is not the way to do it. I should tell you that for 3 years, we've been working with CMMI on the oncology care model. They hired MITRE, Brookings Corporation. They've had patient groups, physician groups. I'll be there next Wednesday at a week from today at CMMI. But literally, they have this model involved no outside experts, no patients, no providers, no nothing.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Yarmouth, you're recognized for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks to the witnesses for your testimony. You know, it seems to me there are two overarching themes that have emerged from this hearing. One is, I would write it bigger than CBO's methodology. It's the combination of CBO, PAYGO rules, and congressional ability to function. And I think that all of us at one time or another have questioned scores from CBO, have question methodology, but also I think we've all seen how far off CBO estimates can be, not because they're incompetent, not because they try to be, but because we're dealing in a world that changes very rapidly, and that an estimate made today is very likely to be very different 2 years from now, and 4 years from now, and 10 years from now. So I think this is something that deserves a lot more attention. And Mr. Chairman, if you and I are fortunate enough to be returned to Congress next year and are sitting in these chairs in one order or another, that I would love to work with you on this entire big question of how we implement budget balancing techniques like PAYGO and CBO procedures, and because I think it's really important going forward. And the second issue, of course, is CMMI and its activities and whether or not it has, as many people apparently feel, exceeded its authority. And I would say, as I did in my opening statement, that if that is the opinion of so many people, we ought to study that, and we ought to, if the arguments are compelling enough, we ought to work on legislation to change it. And this is kind of, I think, the frustration that many of us on the Democratic side have had over the last few years, and that is we see problems with the implementation of various aspects of ACA. In some cases, we have bipartisan agreement on them, but there's never an opportunity to actually make the ACA work better and to make its elements function more effectively, because the majority has been interested in is repealing the entire act, which we've done on 65 different occasions over the last few years. So I would say let's talk together. As I've mentioned, I don't know if it's within our jurisdiction, Mr. Chairman, but if not, let's ask Ways and Means Committee to pursue that and see whether there are reforms in the CMMI that are justified. Mr. Chairman, just these couple of housekeeping measures, you and the ranking member received a statement in support of CMMI and the Part B demo from organizations including AARP and the Medicare Rights Center. The statement reads, quote, "The Part B drug payment model, along with other CMMI demonstrations, has the potential to improve access to high-quality health care for patients and their families. We urge members of Congress to recognize CMMI's pivotal role in transforming how health care is delivered and to provide constructive input to strengthen the agency's programs," unquote. I'd like to enter this letter into the record. Thank you. Mr. Spiro, do you agree that, and I have to be up front, there's not unanimity on the Democratic side of the aisle as to the advisability of the Part B demonstration program, and so I'm not necessarily speaking for everybody on my side, and I'm not coming to haven't reached a definitive judgment myself, but I want to make sure that that's in the record. But do you agree that the Part B demonstration program has the potential to improve access to high-quality care, and are there changes you might recommend to the demonstration to improve its chances of success?
Thanks for the question. I think I absolutely agree that it has the potential to improve the quality of care. I think we don't think enough about financial toxicity. We think a lot about toxic side effects of drugs, but not financial toxicity, which is if drugs are too expensive and their costs are growing by too much each year, that patients may not be able to stay on a regimen, they may not be able to take the drugs that they need. And so doing something about the high and growing cost of drugs is an absolute necessity to improve the quality of care. On your second question about how the demonstration might be modified, we and others, including AARP, Center for American Progress, have submitted comments to CMS, just like other stakeholders have probably submitted comments. And it's important to note that there was that opportunity to submit comments, that they didn't just launch a demonstration without any input from the Congress or from stakeholders, as some claim. They just went forward without asking anyone their thoughts. So we did submit comments. We thought, first of all, that there could be some consumer protections added. We recommended, for example, an ombudsman who would track the experience of patients and providers and recommend changes to the Congress and to CMS in a very quick manner. I also think that, going back to my testimony, I mentioned how there's this concern about the variation of prices around the average sales price and it being an empirical question about what that variation is. If the variation is only, say, 2% around the average sales price, then having a formula that pays a markup of 2.5% is going to be plenty sufficient. Now, there may be outliers to that general statement I just made, and I think that there ought to be an effort to identify the outliers, that providers should submit data on what their acquisition costs are, and if a pattern is identified where a certain type of provider or in a certain area, say a rural area, where their acquisition costs are markedly different, say the 90th percentile or 95th percentile off the median acquisition costs, then there should be perhaps a modification of the markup that's allowed or limited exceptions in the demonstration for those providers that are identified.
Thank you for that, and I might add that a number of our members on this committee have written to CMMI expressing concerns about various elements of the Part B program as well. Yesterday, The Hill published an op-ed by Michael Levitt, Mark McClellan, Leslie Norwalk, and Tom Scully, all of whom served in the George W. Bush administration. And I'd like to enter this op-ed into the record as well.
Without objection.
Yeah, in their post, the authors discussed the importance of CMMI's bundled payment initiatives and suggested possible improvements for the future. And I note that they didn't in any way recommend the repeal, discontinuance of CMMI. I want to ask Mr. Spiro one other question. You talk in your testimony about bipartisan proposals or suggestions for payment and delivery reform. Can you give some examples of where there has been some bipartisan agreement on this?
Well, I think it's an important point, and I'm glad you raised this op-ed in The Hill, which is well-timed and just shows that there is bipartisan support for the work of CMMI and for, and these are all Bush administration officials, for broader payment and delivery system reform. I noted in my testimony some pieces of legislation from this committee, from the chairman, the Bundling and Coordinating Post-Acute Care Act of 2014, which mandated reform of post-acute care payments into bundled payments. Representative Black from this committee sponsoring the Comprehensive Care Payment Innovation Act, which again directs the Secretary to implement bundled payments for episodes of care, including for joint replacement. And then several conservative experts, including Joe Antos and Douglas Holt-Eakin, have expressed at one time or another support for bundled payments. This goes to the broader end goal that we're all trying to achieve, which is the end to fee-for-service medicine, or at least a phasing out of fee-for-service medicine, which we know does not work. We all agree on that. We're looking for alternative, innovative methods. The disagreement is on the implementation. And I think that's
I want to cut you off. I
Yeah.
apologize for that because I want to just get one last point.
Okay.
Remaining seconds. And this relates to something that Mr. Okon talked about, and that was the transition from cancer care from community clinics to hospitals. That is medicine-wide. It's a medicine-wide trend. There are numerous things in the law, disincentives that place too much care in hospitals as opposed to more cost-effective settings, and we ought to undertake that as a congressional mission to look at those parts of the law that actually cost us money for no good clinical outcome. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Antos, I want to ask you about CBO's estimates on the CMMI program. Estimated is going to generate $27 billion in net savings over the period 2016 to 2025. Does this seem to be a reasonable estimate?
Well, I'd say it's a shot in the dark. I don't think, well, actually, I believe that Mr. Hadley made it perfectly clear that they are extrapolating from information that is not current with CMMI's activities, and they have no information, as none of us have information about CMMI's future activities.
Well, there's concern about an overlap in the beneficiary populations between the ACOs and the BPCI, the bundle payment care improvement. Is it likely that as CMMI develops more demonstrations for the potential for these models to overlap, and that would impact then in either scope or population curve, but that wouldn't that impact potential savings?
Yes, indeed. I'm glad you raised that example. The problem is that when there are when there's more than one demonstration going on with a medical group, that you have to decide, CMMI has to decide, where do the savings come from? In this particular case, the example would be ACOs and the bundled payment demonstration. And what CMMI has decided, it's completely arbitrary, but you have to make some rule, is that the savings that are attributed, the savings that come from the bundled payment that the hospital receives are taken out of the ACO. So what that says is that it's very hard to run these projects when you have more than one going on at once, and CMMI has many projects going on at once. But more to the point, it really also says that it's very difficult for the Secretary of HHS to determine what is truly effective and what isn't.
Well, along that same line, it's not only the overlaps, but changing the demo midstream. That creates a problem for an accurate estimate, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. In my opinion, you have to wait until the last change in the project before you can start collecting valid data. And it's fairly clear from what we've seen from CMMI so far that they are fully prepared to make judgments about their projects based on not just the data from the project that they are actually testing, but also from the data for the project that they clearly decided was wrong.
Well, the Office of the Chief Actuary certified models for expansion, yet CMMI has yet to use that authority. After 5 years, don't you think that information should be used to help inform CMMI on the baseline?
I think that's a good judgment not to move forward by in changing policy based on the actuary's judgment. Certainly in the case of the preventive services demonstration, I can't remember the name of it precisely, but in that case, the actuary found very, very weak evidence that this project would not increase cost. That's not a very good basis for policymaking.
I want to shift from the focus on the cost and the estimate on savings to how it impacts delivery of care. And Dr. Madden, what changes have you had to make in your practice since you decided to participate?
Well, we are an early participant in the BPCI program. And we recognize, based on just our care model, that there are certainly very many areas that we could apply changes to that would save money and not impact the quality of care or improve the quality of care. And we have hired case managers to help us assist in identifying problems before the cases that we do, identify problems that are potential issues. Then intra-hospital, we have situations where we're working very closely with our hospitals to make sure that we are using the best possible instruments, we use the best possible equipment, but we do not overstay our welcome in the hospital.
How's it impacted, though, your patients?
Our patients are generally very supportive of it. They are aware that we're participating in this program. They have realized shorter hospital stays. They have realized less readmission rate into the hospital, and they've realized an improvement in their overall outcomes over time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Dr. McDermott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Okon and the pharmaceutical industry have criticized this proposal on Part B. Under current law, Medicare pays the average sales price for Part B drugs, plus a 6% add-on. Why 6%? You'll never find any justification for that number. They pulled it out of the air in 2003 when they passed the Part D drug bill through this House. They kept the voting on for almost 4 hours until they twisted enough arms to get that bill through. And buried in it was this 6% increase for the pharmaceutical industry in Part B. Now, Medicare now pays more than $20 billion a year on Part B drugs. It's becoming increasingly clear that we need to take action to get costs under control. Following Willie Sutton, you look where the money is. That's where you go. One meaningful step in the Innovation Center's proposal would lower the Part B to 2.5%. That's probably pulled out of the air as much as the 6% was, but it is a reduction of 3.5%. The flat payment of the demonstration is designed to cover the aggregate costs of Part B drugs. Any savings achieved will come from improved incentives and corresponding changes in prescriber behavior. In other words, if this saves money, it will be because we have cut waste out of the system, not because we're denying patients any medicine they need. In fact, because beneficiaries have had to shoulder 20% of the costs of Part B drugs, providing them with cheaper options will actually expand their access to treatments. That's why AARP, Families USA, Medical Rights Center, and a lot of other consumer groups strongly support this proposal. But what worries me is the opposition. And it's, you can see it around here all the time. I mean, I've been here 28 years, and you can see the opposition and the disturbing influences the industry has on these groups that allegedly advocate for patients. Now, I read a report from Public Citizen that says that 3/4 of the groups opposing Part B demonstration are funded by the pharmaceutical industry, including Mr. Okon's organization. This raises a number of questions. Mr. Spiro, do you see a potential conflict of interest in somebody coming in and testifying against a proposal that cuts their profits?
Well, I'm not going to speak to that because I assume the conflict is disclosed and you, the committee, will take into account how to weigh the testimony. But on your general point, I think it is a serious problem when patient groups are financed by the drug industry. You take this recent example with EpiPen. Do you know how that those price increases came to the attention of policymakers and activists? It's through social media by individual patients not affiliated with any group. The reason why is the patient groups involved were funded by the drug industry. So they did not raise any protests with Mylan about those price increases. Another example is the National Health Council, which purports to represent patients, receives 65% of its revenue from the drug industry. Another group, which you may be aware of, is actually a front in the sense that it's run literally out of the office of a lobby firm. And the partners at the lobby firm are the staff members of the patient group. That should be disclosed, and that should be subject to full transparency. I think the general point here is we actually don't know, in a lot of cases, what the conflicts of interest are. And that's because when Congress put in the Sunshine Rule, where physicians have to disclose their payments to, drug manufacturers have to disclose their payments to physicians, there was actually a provision that groups would also have to, drug industry would also have to disclose the contributions to groups as well. And that was a Senator Grassley provision, actually. And I think that the Congress should really consider reinstating that provision.
When was that provision taken out?
Well, it was in the course of that provision, the general provision was in the Affordable Care Act. I'm not familiar with when that was modified to take out that particular provision or why or who did it, but it's something the Congress ought to look at.
Gentleman's time has
Thank you
expired.
very much.
Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. Dr. Antos, from my perspective, CMMI has a lot of power. How can we ensure that CMMI is insulated from political pressure that may influence its actions?
That's a great question. There's always the risk that any activity, including research activities conducted by executive branch agencies, could be influenced by the political agenda of whoever's in power.
Can CMMI refuse to test a demo, for example?
Well, I'm sure that's a matter of negotiation within HHS and perhaps higher up.
Okay, let me be more specific. Would CMMI ever evaluate an idea and say no to a proposed demo from the administration?
I think that's possible. It depends on the political circumstances, but it also depends on the nature of the proposal. Clearly, a far-fetched proposal is going to be rejected because CMMI doesn't want to be embarrassed by a project that's doomed to failure.
Well, in the previous panel, I pointed out there are guidelines and standards by which CMMI is supposed to conduct these demos. Right. Presumably, if they're conducting them within those guidelines, and there's some question about who gets to oversee those adherence to those guidelines, if they were sticking to the guidelines, the answer would be absolutely they could refuse, right? Because they would evaluate it and determine that it's not going to save. It wouldn't be in the American people's best interest.
That's true, but when we talk, for example, about evaluating a phase 1 demonstration and deciding whether it's a success enough to go to phase 2, to expand it potentially much more widely, potentially on a mandatory basis, then you have a problem because the judgment or the data that the judgment is based is inevitably limited. It would be limited under any circumstances, but it's especially limited here because CMMI presumably has been making changes in its demonstration program all along.
Okay, all right. Well, today's healthcare providers have quite a few options when it comes to demonstrating savings within their practices or their health systems. But I quite frankly worry that all of these options can lead to confusion and potentially discourage participation in further practice improvements. So, Dr. Madden and Mr. Okon, let's say a doctor is participating in an ACO and a bundle. How are the savings achieved from both of these initiatives counted, and how do they fit together?
Well, I think that first of all, as I understand it, it's a total sum game. So if for instance there's some savings in the ACO, savings in the bundle, you don't get the double dip. You take your savings that you're entitled to, and the rest goes back into the program or goes back into the overall healthcare situation, either the hospital or the practice, depending on what you're in.
Very, very difficult, Mr. Johnson. It's going to be next to impossible. If you look at the 200 practices or facilities that are participating in the oncology care model from CMMI, and then you overlap this on top of it, the experimental design and being versed in this earlier in my career is just impossible to figure out where exactly those savings are going to come from or coming from.
Okay, all right. So how does the lack of clarity for providers affect their practice decisions?
Well, the problem is, again, that this oncology care model, as I said, was 3 years in the making. Huge collaboration. I give CMMI a lot of credit for all the collaboration that they have done on this. It's just so marked when all of a sudden in the middle of implementing or starting to implement this oncology care model, all of a sudden this Part B model was airdropped in. And even though it had a rule around it or a proposed rule around it, the development included nobody in terms of like with the OCM model. So it's really difficult.
Okay. Dr. Madden, quickly, any comment on that?
I think
lack of clarity
I think that he's very, very correct. I think that what we've done in our program, though, as being part of an ACO and a BPCI, is we again have said no double dipping. It's just you get a certain amount of benefit from being in the program, and then everything else goes back to the center.
Gentleman's time.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Luan Grisham, be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spiro, I want to follow up. My colleague, John Yarmouth, really hit on many of the issues I wanted to discuss with you and the panel, which is, I think that bipartisan, there's going to be little disagreement, even in this committee, about healthcare costs. And about making sure that we're doing everything in our power, both from a public perspective and a private sector implementation aspect, that we do everything we can to bring those in line. And your example was the example, Mr. Spiro, that I wanted to give, that you look at the EpiPen issue, and actually I would disagree with you. I had plenty of individual constituents talk to me about the 550% increase and reminding me that it saved the lives of many children. We have one of the highest sort of allergic, interestingly enough, adolescent populations per capita in the country. So I'm well aware of the impact that this has on providers and on patients who require these life-saving techniques. But at the same time, to your point, I want CMS to have an opportunity not only to do innovations and to work with the private sector on implementation, but given the climate here, it is difficult for Congress, whether we agree that that should be the case or not, to deal with these issues in a timely and productive manner. But I see CMS in general as having this very difficult responsibility. They see a spike in a healthcare cost, and they cut the tops off those trees. And I'll give you two aspects of that. They don't have capacity anymore, given the fact that there's not enough folks to really look at the detail to understand what the meaning is of that particular spike. I love the idea of CMMI, and I agree with many members of the panel that there's been some good work out of that, out of the Innovation Center. But I also wonder if they really understand the implications. And for me, particularly on this cancer demonstration, there is clear evidence that rural providers are not getting their administrative costs covered. They are closing in my state. They are closing in other states, which means even if the outpatient costs were the same for cancer care from hospitals, and it is not, it is higher, you're now asking a cancer patient in my state to drive 5 hours for chemo care. Well, this doesn't make any sense, and I loved your idea. So that I'm looking for, what are those balances? Because this is not balanced. I sent a letter. I'm very disappointed that CMS is not here today. CMS did not respond to my letter about, are you thinking about these issues? I'm very upset about that. I'm going to say to this committee, that's typical for me. I don't get very great responses out of HHS and CMS on my questions and issues, and I certainly haven't gotten a satisfactory, they're just silent on this issue. So I like the idea that you have about the ombudsman. How you do that, though, who has to listen to the ombudsman? I ran aging, and the long-term care ombudsman is a great program, but it has no regulatory teeth. So if you've got a strong ombudsman and you've got a state that cares about long-term care issues and protecting that population, they do great work because their legislative body put in reforms that meet the recommendations of the ombudsman. But if CMS isn't going to pay attention to that, you got the same information that I get directly from the patients who got told that they got to drive now 5 hours for chemo care that they can't afford the copays on. Huge problem. So I would really, if you've got more ideas because of the time limitations in this committee, ombudsman I'm interested in, depends on how it would work. But what can we do to shore up our system so that CMMI are paying attention and are more transparent about the issues they know that aren't going to be quite right? Because really, the problem is healthcare is so complicated, and the financing of it is so complicated. I don't care what idea you have. It has unintended consequences. What I'm looking for is sort of a smart innovation model which takes into account those aspects and tries to mitigate them. And instead, because we're always fighting, they want to do a broad brush because it's less challengeable. But it hurts providers and it hurts patients. What else can we do?
Well, I think that I can't really speak for CMMI. I assume they're in a bit of a deliberative mode right now. They've received all these comments and they're sorting through them and reading them and considering them.
It gives me hope.
So maybe that's why you haven't heard back from them. I haven't heard back from them either, if that's of any consolation to you. But I think that the key really is to think about it this way. Can we all agree on in a bipartisan manner that healthcare costs are a problem? I hope the answer is yes.
Me too. I just hope we have a way to manage this better. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists as well for all of your testimony, and appreciate your forbearance with being on a second panel. I know that's a challenge. Dr. Antos, let me touch on, follow up on Mr. Okita and Mr. Garrett's comments on the model itself, on the methodology itself. You said, I think in response to Mr. Garrett, that an error was made, or a decision was made at CBO in 2010 that has resulted in all this. What was that decision?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the decision was to estimate cost savings for an activity that was not very well specified, other than this laundry list of possible reforms that were in the Affordable Care Act. But it's highly speculative. And if you look back at past behavior by CBO, they would never have assumed savings from demonstrations. Indeed, Mr. Hadley said that the past history, by and large, told you that you weren't going to get savings, you were going to get costs.
Now, his response to that, I think, would be that this program's different because it allows CMMI to turn on a dime, and if something didn't work, and they can change it, and it provides for a mandatory allowance of mandatory demonstrations. Do you buy that?
No. First of all, if mandating participation was such a good idea, why aren't all the demonstrations mandatory? They're not. The only ones that are mandatory seem to be the ones that are likely to cause political troubles. Secondly, the idea that, I'm sorry, what was the first part of your point?
Well, that CMMI can turn on a dime.
So speed does not mean accuracy. I mean, I have to admit that when I was running essentially the same operation back in the ancient days of the Healthcare Financing Administration, we were slow, no question about that. But in fact, it regularly took 5 years to conduct a demonstration and several more years to evaluate it. And more often than not, the results had ambiguity to them. That hasn't changed. That's the nature of research.
You highlighted in your testimony Dr. Jha's study or remarks or findings on the shared savings program, and in fact, CBO estimated the shared savings program had saved a certain amount, and Dr. Jha says no. In fact, if you look at the whole picture, it's $216 million in loss. Do you know if CBO has recalculated their score for that?
I would say that CBO has not issued, I don't think that CBO has issued a score for that project. There's no reason for them to provide a budget score for any ongoing project unless Congress takes action. They provide scores in response to congressional action. They don't typically provide scores for ongoing activities of the executive branch.
This is the important point, and that is that when Congress then proposes to take action, then what CBO is now doing, isn't it correct that what CBO is now doing is scoring it against this nebulous series of possibilities that CMMI could come up with, and attributing now $38 billion in savings over the next 10 years to that, and that unless the specificity of the legislative proposal dictates that whatever CMI might do isn't going to occur, then it costs us money as opposed to CMMI, which has just made up all these possibilities.
Yes, I generally agree with that.
Mr. Okon, I want to talk with you about the incredible Part B demo that is now going to incorporate 75% of the nation, which is just astounding in fact, can that be described as a demonstration if it's 75%?
No, that's a fundamental change in reimbursement as well.
And you mentioned informed consent, I believe. You want to talk a little bit about informed consent?
Well, as I said to Mr. Akita, I'm not a physician, but I actually ran an oncology clinical research network, so I know experimental design, I know oncology research. And when a patient decides, along with a physician, to go into a clinical trial, they are basically given informed consent, and that is full disclosure in terms of what the drug can do, what the research is all about, and the fact that they are in a research design. And then in oncology, because you can't test it against placebo, it's tested against standard of care, so you either end up in a test or a control cell, and you're randomized. And those same words that I said in my testimony are exactly what CMMI has used in the proposed rule. So you're talking about experimental clinical research. They're going to change behavior. They've even said that in the rule, but there's no informed consent. And in addition to that, Dr. Price, as you know, being a physician, there are patient safeguards. There's monitoring of adverse events, and there are other patient safeguards in place in clinical research. There are none here.
None of that exists. Dr. Madden, on informed consent, when you're treating a patient and you're participating in a demonstration project, for example, BPCI, you get informed consent to do that, do you not?
Absolutely. We start out with introducing the patient to our case manager, and in that early discussion, the patient's informed of our participation, and then what we're going to do, the procedure, the risks, benefits, complications, we get it all.
And now the CJR program is different in what respect?
Well, the CJR program is different in that it's a mandatory participation by physicians who may not have the infrastructure set up to do some of the things that are necessary to gain the cost savings.
So are the physicians the ones that volunteer and say, yeah, I'd like to participate in that mandatory program?
No, physicians are simply, if you practice at a hospital which is involved in the program, you're participating. So you don't get a choice to opt out unless you relinquish your privileges, which is, again, really not the way we like to work.
So, if I was still practicing out there and I was in I practiced in a hospital that was identified by CMMI that they were going to come under CJR, then I would have no choice, and my patients would have no choice whatsoever to not participate in the CJR program. Is that?
That's absolutely correct. Your privileges at the hospital would require you to take care of the patients in the hospital in the manner that the hospital directs, which is be part of the CJR.
Have you ever seen anything like that?
Not since I was a resident, when I had to do whatever anybody else wanted. But no, in private practice, you know, one of the reasons we physicians go into private practice is because we like being the boss and we like directing things. But we're also highly competitive. We want to be the best. And if I come in and I find out that you've taken care of 3 hip patients today, I want to take care of 4 because I want to be better. But I also want to do it the best possible so that other patients come back and see me and come to me and visit with me.
And in fact, that's what you all did with BPCI. I want to commend you all for the incredible improvements. Readmission to hospitals down 14%, reduction in surgical site infection of 43%, joint infection reduced 25%, myocardial infarction and heart attacks reduced 23% in the perioperative period, urinary tract infection reduced 23%, pulmonary embolus reduced 27%. That was all done through the voluntary program, correct?
That's correct. And the advantage during the voluntary program is that you get a group of physicians who can then decide what's necessary to achieve the goals that we're looking for. You get a group of physicians who are like-minded and say, we can do this, and collaborate to use best practices. What ends up happening is that the larger group of physicians out in the community say, hey, Ortho Virginia is doing it really well. Let's go talk to them, see how they're doing it. And again, we orthopedists are pretty much collaborative. We like sharing, and it's all best about the patient.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to commend you for the work that you all are doing, and just point out that if from a mandatory standpoint in CJR, if the docs aren't ready for it, that doesn't make any difference. If the patients aren't ready for it, that doesn't make any, if the hospitals aren't ready for it, that doesn't make any difference. That is the people providing the care. If they're not ready to undertake this project, doesn't make any difference because the government's going to tell them what to do. Mr. Spiro, I just wanted to thank you for recognizing that we've come up with some proposals to improve quality and improve care and improve and to decrease costs. I would just respectfully suggest that that's the role of policymakers. That's what we're supposed to do. That's what our constituents elect us to do, is to come up with better policy, as opposed to somebody who's not accountable to anybody at all coming up with that policy and then not allowing us, through the CBO rule that they've determined, to be able to affect that any way at all. So that's the frustration. That's the core of the concern and the frustration that we have. This has been incredibly helpful for me. I hope that others have found it enlightening. I am heartened by the encouragement by Mr. Yarmouth to work together on many of these items, and look forward to maintaining these exact same seats next Congress. And when we do that, I look forward to working with you as we try to improve the situation for docs and hospitals and patients out there. I want to thank Dr. Antos, Dr. Madden, Mr. Spiro, and Mr. Okon for appearing before us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing, and those questions and your answers will be made part of the permanent record. Any member wishing to do so may put them in the record within 7 days. And with that, we stand adjourned.
Thank you very much. Thank you.